Chapter 305. Noon, 12:45 a.m. 3:45 a.m. A terrifying bounty that had not been seen in the past 6 years spread like wildfire through all of the channels in the collection of 10,000 sins. After taking a tenth of the bounty, the largest intermediary platform in the dark side of the sublimated world took all of the bounty and sent it to the eastern part of Dongsha. The bounty of death notices turned into pop-up windows and text messages that appeared in the phones of every registered person in Dongsha. It didn't matter if they were sublimators or not, where they worked or who they were. More notices were sent out in all directions through the dark net, delivering the notice of a high reward to every senior member. 400 million US dollars. Dozens of actuaries completed the liquidation of the bounty within half an hour. They converted 1/3 of the shares in the border region into cash. No more, no less, and began to transfer and purchase them. Enough money to allow a sublimator to live a luxurious life for the rest of their lives had been poured into the bounty pool. As long as the bounty target was brought to a place that even had a Wi-Fi connection to the collection of 10,000 sins, they would be able to obtain this sum of money. When the pop-up window appeared on the screen, there was a brief moment of silence, followed by a wave of commotion. So that's how it is? In a short 3 minutes, the entire process was laid out on eldest cousin's desk. Zhu Hongchun flipped through the report in shock for a long time before he couldn't help but laugh self-mockingly. Should I call him resolute and decisive, or rash and reckless? But no matter what, it's still very satisfying. Can you stop watching the show? Doom third sighed and slammed another stack of reports on the table in front of him. 10 minutes ago, the chainsaw ghoul entered the discovery realm. Apparently, the Eye of Nightmares is also showing signs of activity. The border sensors have also captured the movements of 6 other wanted criminals, as well as more than 16 border mercenary groups. This is within Dongsha's territory, and it's heading towards our territory. You can't possibly not react at all, right? React? What kind of reaction do you want? Eldest cousin was amused and turned to look at her. Shouldn't we do what we should do? Those who break the law will be captured, and those who are guilty will be killed. Those who dare to resist will be served with missiles and mortars. Those who are captured dead will be sent to Jixia as specimens. Those who are captured alive will be sent to Jixia as test subjects. As for those who haven't broken the law in Dongsha, what can we do? Are they prohibited from entering the country? Are we just going to ignore everything? Yes, of course. Big cousin spun the lighter between his fingers. As we all know, Dongsha is a place that prohibits individuals from possessing firearms and knives. I really hope they don't carry any prohibited items. As he spoke, he couldn't help but chuckle softly. I really like this young man, why sure. Look at him. He alone has created so many collective third-class merits for us. There are even pictures of this year's advanced role models. Go and see if there's anyone else who hasn't hitchhiked before. Hurry up and catch them. Once the fishing season is over, it'll be hard to catch them. While Big Cousin was laughing happily, in a huge underground facility of the Jinling Social Security Bureau, lights lit up one by one, and hurried footsteps ran in all directions. The largest sublimator violence mechanism in the entire eastern part of Dongsha was operating at full force. Full of anticipation. More ascendants, more assassins, and more border mercenaries were like flies in the latrine, bamboo shoots after the rain, and customers outside the supermarkets on Black Friday. They kept making their moves. Under the temptation of the 400 million reward, which was directly linked to the huge reward of source form crystals, they flocked over. Half an hour later, in the wilderness, Huaishur expressionlessly pulled the axe out of the head of the guy who had just drilled out of the ground. Then, he turned around and picked through the messy corpses on the ground. He pulled out a usable shotgun, hung it on the saddle, pulled the white horse's reins, and continued forward. On the horse's back, Ai Ching raised her eyes to recognize the sunlight with a calm expression. Jinling isn't in this direction. She asked, "You're not sending me to the astronomy meeting? Defection is a heavier crime than murder. Do you understand?" Huaishur didn't say anything and continued forward. This is only the first batch of people who move the fastest. Even if my cousin doesn't do it himself, he will definitely set up a reward. More and more people will come to our door later. The woman on the horse raised her eyes and stared straight at the sun, as if she could see the countless satellites in low Earth orbit aimed at them. She waved her hand slightly. "Where are you going to take me?" AI Ching asked. "The nearest public border entrance is at least 200 kilometers away from here. Or do you just want to elope with me?" Huaisher ignored her. She paused for a moment, and her expression became subtle. She seemed to be smiling. "You know I was supposed to get engaged today, right? If I didn't come, your funeral would have been held today." Huaisher replied indifferently. "Don't imagine that someone will come back and blow up the axle of your wedding car. A woman like you won't be able to get married." AI Ching's expression didn't change. She just asked calmly, "I just want to consult Mr. Huaisher of the astronomy meeting about the escape plan. Just shut up." Huaisher turned his head. For the first time since leaving the Yin family, he looked into AI Ching's eyes and told her word by word, "Don't talk anymore." AI Ching seemed to have caught a glimpse of the anger in those eyes. It was rare for her to be obedient. She didn't say anything else. Or rather, she already knew the answer. She raised her head and faced the wind blowing from afar. Her long hair fluttered in the wind. The wilderness seemed to be endless. There was no end in sight. "It's so free," AI Ching whispered softly, even if this freedom was so illusory and short. In the distance, smoke and dust rose. An off-road vehicle crossed the mountains and whistled over. It stopped in front of the white horse. The middle-aged man driving the car stared at the two through the glass. He lowered his head and looked at his phone, comparing it with the photo on it. He pushed open the door and got out. He pulled out a heavy halberd from the back of the car and held it with both hands. He blocked in front of the white horse. "Don't block the way." Huaisher's hand pressed on the sword of virtue. "I was just lucky and happened to be camping nearby. There are more people behind," the man with the halberd replied. "Even if I make way, you can't pass. So you won't let me? So why don't you let me try?" A phantom appeared behind the ascendant who blocked the way. An identical version of himself walked out from the body, holding the same halberd. There was no difference between them. Dongsha genealogy, Tantai Jiao. The two figures who looked like twins said in unison, "If you really have the confidence to take her away, you might as well treat this as a warm-up." Huaisher stepped forward, pulled out the sword of virtue, and stepped forward to meet the two phantoms who were fading at the same time. At that moment, two overlapping roars burst out. With a roar, the two figures of Tantai Jiao instantly disappeared from where they were. They plowed a deep crack in the ground and pointed straight at Huaisher. The halberd screeched and set off a mournful howl from the almost identical resonance. The iron light flashed and disappeared. Huaisher raised his wrist, and the blade slashed down. Forward, he sheathed the sword. Behind him, the two figures slid to the ground. A crack appeared on the halberd in their hands and on their chests at the same time. And in the air in front of Huaisher, blood spurted out. The real Tantai Jiao staggered back. She couldn't believe how Huaisher saw through the real doppelganger created by the combination of her soul power and the impermanence's stigmata. After holding your breath, the sound of your pulse became louder. Huaisher raised his hand and rubbed his ears. "It hurt my ears." Tantai Jiao froze for a moment, then fell to the ground with a bitter smile. "Thank you for showing mercy." "No, you're too weak. I can still hold back." Huaisher turned around, took the reins of the white horse, and continued forward. He heard Tantai Jiao's voice behind him. "There are still people waiting for you ahead. Huaisher, you can't go far." Huaisher's footsteps paused for a moment. He didn't speak and continued forward. After flowing through the stream, he saw the figure sitting on the shore, waiting for a long time. It was unexpectedly familiar. "I see Amber in here." The long-lost girl closed the lid of the lunchbox and looked up with a smile. "You know I'm a border hunter, right? There are many missions." Huaisher said, "It doesn't have to be this one." Amber shook her head. "But I need money. I can give it to you." Huaisher tried to negotiate. "Even if you don't think it's enough, with my current status, I can still borrow a lot." "You're working so hard for your boss." Li Jian glanced at AI Ching on horseback and smiled mischievously. "Unfortunately, I don't want the money you're giving me." She slowly got up and casually hung her coat on a branch nearby, revealing the sports vest inside and the sword belt hanging at her waist. There were 2 katanas and a wakizashi. "Don't you want to wait?" Huaishur asked. "I beat Luo Xian. Are you sure you can do it like this? A victory won't count as a victory won't be counted. Don't be too proud, Huaishur." Amber shook her head and slowly pushed the katana out of the sheath with her thumb. Her smile became sweeter. "By the way, there's actually no need to wait," she said, "because there are too many people. We discussed it and decided to go in order. I'm the luckiest. I'm second." Huaishur couldn't help but laugh. He looked around and vaguely saw a few figures waiting in the depths of the forest. His eyes became mocking. "You're going to beat me like this?" "Yes." Amber nodded. A clear voice burst out from the sheath and stung Huaishur's eardrums. She said, "I'm going to beat you." In an instant, she was close by. It was the same as Huaishur's. "You step." No, it was even more mature and efficient than Huaishur's you step. After combining the steps of Ingzhou swordsmanship, it had taken on a different appearance. After discarding the other unimportant elements, only the most violent explosive power was left. Using all the strength in the body, gathering into a beam, integrating the strength that had long surpassed the imagination of ordinary people into the skills that had been tempered thousands of times. In an instant, the katana was unsheathed. Separated by 5 steps, the blade that was originally only a little more than 3 feet suddenly grew to more than 2 meters. However, the speed became more and more astonishing as it was swung. It was as bright as a shooting star. In an instant, the light tore through people's eyes. Revolving Heaven Sword Dance Combo. Chapter 306. A mournful sound suddenly burst forth. From Huaishur's hand, the spear of compassion shot forward, the cross-shaped spear blade blocking the sword's slashing trajectory without any warning. But then he saw the blade suddenly shrink, instantly shrinking by a meter without any reason. After bypassing the spear's interception without any obstruction, it shot out like a viper. Huaishur leaned back and saw the sharp blade sweep past the tip of his nose. When he abruptly propped himself up, he saw the blade that swept past him suddenly shrink again. The originally astonishing speed actually increased once more. From Hu Po's spin, it drew an arc lightly and chopped down from top to bottom. This time, following the slashing of the blade, not only did its length increase explosively, even its weight increased by 10 to 20 times. The sound of air being torn apart exploded. Bang! The axe of wrath was lifted up and collided with the blade. Huaishur actually felt a wave of numbness in his hand. But Hu Po's movements didn't stop. Her feet crossed, and she took a step forward, borrowing the momentum from her nimble spin to sweep across again. The strength of the blade was even greater than before. The sound of metal colliding continuously burst forth. Huaishur retreated pathetically, but Hu Po stepped forward step by step. It was as if she was dancing, waving her sword in her crisscrossing footsteps. This was a sword dance that was formed by the combination of a sword technique that had been brought to the point of perfection and soul power. This power was endlessly stacked and transformed into a sword dance. The sword dance continued. 1 time, 2 times, 3 times. The more she dodged, the more terrifying the strength of the sword dance became. From the spinning of heaven and earth, it established an unstoppable strength. From the moment the sword dance began, the initiative was already in her hands. By the time Huaishur understood what was going on, a green hue had already spread all over her arm. She swung her axe with all her might, creating an insignificant gap in the sword dance. Huaishur drove straight in, ignoring the rapidly shrinking blade that doubled in weight. The strength of the drummer burst forth, bombarding her abdomen at close range. Boom! A blood-red armor appeared on her body without any warning, forcibly taking on Huaishur's punch that was like a pile driver. Inside, the amber roared and pulled out another tachi from its sheath. Drawing the sword, the power gathered in the sword dance followed the guidance of the arm and poured into the blade of the tachi. The power that had been accumulated for a long time turned into an invincible speed, bursting out from the scabbard. A fierce light flashed. Huaishir took a step back, and cracks appeared on the sacrificial knife. Not only was his defensive stance broken, but he was also about to lose his grip on the hilt of his sword. "It's over, Huaishir." Inside, Hooper roared and swung his twin swords. "Yes, it's over." At the last moment, Huaishir heaved a sigh of relief and forcibly raised the sword of virtue. The powerful chop was blocked by the sword of virtue. It was a piece of cake. There was only a crisp sound. Slap. The two sabers left his hands. Hoopa staggered back and fell to the ground, gasping for breath with all her might. It was only now that she saw the irises that had grown out of nowhere under her feet. They were so pure white and beautiful. Too despicable. She took off her helmet and raised her head with difficulty. "You actually used poison." Huaishir casually applied a layer of silver blood potion on the wound between his thumb and index finger. He shrugged slightly and looked at her with pity. "Girl, times have changed." As he spoke, he raised his hand and knocked on the back of her neck. It was over. Huaishir turned around and wanted to lead the horse, but he suddenly felt a premonition of death behind him. He suddenly turned back, stretched out his hand, and clenched his 5 fingers. He grabbed the arrow that was whistling towards him. Between his 5 fingers, the arrow was still buzzing, and the tip was only a hair's breadth away from Huaishir's eyes. In the depths of the forest, the gray-robed figure didn't hit the target. He immediately pulled out an arrow stuck in the ground beside his feet and shot again. The arrow's trajectory was erratic and strange, like a ghost appearing and disappearing from the dense forest. It was already right in front of him, but for some reason, Huaishir felt that the other party's actions were simply childish to the point of somewhat comical. Even if he had never touched that kind of weapon, he instinctively felt that the bow wasn't used like that. Bang! The sword of virtue swept across, directly cutting the arrow that had strangely appeared behind his head in two. In the next instant, Huaishir's figure had already disappeared from where he was, submerging into the dense forest. The dark green flames of the mountain ghost instantly ignited from his body. The gray-robed man was stunned for a moment. He actually carried his bow on his back, turned around, and fled. It looked like he wanted to fight a prolonged guerrilla war with Huaishir. Unfortunately, in the dense forest, guerrilla war with a mountain ghost? Are you sure you're not mistaken? In the blink of an eye, Huaishir had already flown out from the thistles and thorns. With a sudden swing of his sword, he nailed the gray-robed man to the tree trunk. Then, he heard a crackling sound beside him. In the darkness, the originally empty scene instantly shattered, revealing a dozen figures hidden behind the encirclement, as well as the automatic weapons in their hands that had already been unlocked. Huaishir was stunned for a moment. He looked back at the twitching archer on the tree trunk and immediately understood. An ambush! In the next instant, the gunfire of the mercenaries at the border burst forth. In the depths of the dense forest, there were continuous loud noises, as if bombs were constantly being detonated. On the white horse, Ai Qing quietly looked at the thick smoke rising from the forest in the distance. But soon, she turned her head slightly and looked behind her. Her slender eyebrows raised slightly. "Didn't you say to come one by one?" "Originally, hee. That's what I said." A stooped old man was dragging a heavy chainsaw behind him. Ai Qing looked over, and under his excessively sparse white hair, he squeezed out a wriggling smile on his ugly face. He chuckled strangely, but I don't agree. The chainsaw that he was dragging behind him still carried the stench of blood and broken bone fragments. It was as if countless people's screams were entangled in it. Layers of suspicious leather were wrapped around the handle. It was almost emitting substantial resentment and hostility. There was no doubt that it was a border relic that was close to evil. Even if it had been stained with blood not long ago, it was still crying out hungrily at this moment. The white horse turned slightly and let out a low roar. Its eyes were vigilant. The iron hooves under its feet knocked on the rocks intermittently, and sparks burst forth. It exhaled hot breaths. It was as if a charge was imminent. "Ah, it seems that he has really left." The stooped old man who dragged the chainsaw chuckled. His expression twitched, and his pupils, which had shrunk to the size of a needle, stared at AI Ching. He panted roughly. 400 million, 400 million, and it doesn't matter if he's dead or alive. Such good meat, child, such good meat. In his hand, the chainsaw suddenly roared hungrily. It spun wildly, and blood spurted out from the chainsaw. Chainsaw ghoul, Horgus? The woman on the horse raised her eyebrows, as if she was surprised by her current charm. Are you really sure that I have no power to resist? Yes, yes, please resist it will. Horgus laughed sharply. He grinned, revealing his sharp teeth that still had food residue hanging on them. This child is quite fond of struggling prey, the chainsaw roared. So, AI Ching nodded. Okay. At that moment, the white horse neighed. Under the control of AI Ching's horsemanship, which was obviously much better than Huaishi's, it galloped forward. It raised its iron hooves to face the spinning chainsaw. Its huge eyes were full of disdain. I'll kick you to death, you old pervert. In an instant, Horgus collapsed into a stinking mist. It suddenly boiled, swept past the white horse, and reformed in midair. It was the chainsaw that slashed down on AI Ching's face. AI Ching was expressionless. She pulled out the shotgun that Huaishir had left behind from the saddle and aimed it at the old man's ferocious face. The trigger was pulled. Dark purple light gushed out from the ordinary-looking shotgun. In an instant, it tore through the air and turned into a torrential rain, instantly defeating Horgus. Horgus turned back into smoke and retreated in a sorry state. When he reappeared, his face was already covered with a layer of pockmarked scars. Now that you've opened your mouth, you must want to ask what that was just now. AI Ching replied expressionlessly. Actually, it doesn't matter if I tell you. My soul is called the Eye of Liberation. It can stimulate and use my own sapphira and any sapphira crystal in the most violent way. The simplest way is an explosion. If it's restrained and triggered at the same time, it can form the effect of a firearm. She paused and asked seriously, Now you must have experienced my disdain just now, right? The young girl pulled the bolt and aimed it at his face again. To be honest, an old pervert like you who hasn't taken a bath for who knows how long. Just looking at you makes me feel so disgusted that I'm about to throw up. Horgus' expression twitched. The chainsaw in his hand let out a hungry roar. It was obvious that he was unable to restrain his anger. But immediately afterwards, he heard footsteps behind him. He turned around in astonishment. In the middle of the burning forest, amidst the rising smoke, the returning mountain ghost dragged his axe and walked out of the flames step by step. He revealed a ferocious smile at the old man. I just left for a while, and another guest came? Yes, a rare evil guest. He has a bounty of at least 170 million US dollars on him. AI Ching let out a long sigh and put down the gun. Her face was pale. Just putting on an act has already used up all of my strength. That bullet just now had already used up all of her origin substance. It's fine. The mountain ghost, who had exceeded his limit, slightly twisted his neck, and a crisp sound burst forth from his joints. I'll take care of him. Sensing the fluctuations of origin substance erupting from the newcomer's chest like a volcano, even Horgus, who had been at the peak of the third rank for several decades, changed his expression. He became more and more incredulous. Why was he so strong? And why was he so fast? An entire border mercenary group. Even if it was impossible for everyone to be ascendants, even if there were 19 pigs carrying guns and cannons on their backs, they should be able to last at least 15 minutes if they were left to be killed. It's very simple. Huaishir held the sword of virtue and the sacrificial knife upside down with both hands and propped himself up. In place, he assumed a lunging posture. When he raised his head, the corners of his mouth revealed a happy expression that even the ghouls were frightened. Of course, that's because I'm stronger than you bunch of trash. In that instant, the chainsaw suddenly shook and let out a terrified shriek and wail. Chapter 307. At that moment, Horgus felt as if he had been struck by lightning. Not only was he shocked by the murderous intent, but he was also horrified by the evil chainsaw in his hand under the gaze of that handsome face. It was a terrifying experience that he had never had before. When he dug out this chainsaw from the American ruins, he couldn't help but be infected by the endless hunger and ferocity contained in the chainsaw. He was intoxicated by the murmurs that kept ringing in his ears, and he grew older and stranger day by day. Even though he was spurned and despised because of his depravity, this power was so powerful and violent that no words could slander it. He, who was connected to the chainsaw by blood, had long become an evil beast in the abyss, feeding on blood. Like a symbiotic relationship, he provided the chainsaw with blood, and the chainsaw provided him with power. But now, he felt an unprecedented fear from the chainsaw's constantly fluctuating ferocious source substance. It was as if he had glimpsed the essence of something more ferocious and crazy than himself through that blood-stained face. He was being watched by malice and predators from a higher dimension that were immersed in the depths of the darkness. He was shivering. He stepped back in shock and blinked in disbelief. He tried to see the gradually blurring figure again, but after a moment of darkness, Huaishi's smiling face had already appeared in front of him. It was so clear and so cold. It was close at hand. He looked at Horgus's twisted face and smiled. "What are you looking at?" In front of Horgus. He raised his palm and clenched his 5 fingers. His iron-green skin revealed traces of scarlet, like iron that had been heated red. He swung his fist. The drummers roared. Horgus subconsciously wanted to block the chainsaw in front of him, but before he could raise his hand, he felt his vision go black. It was as if he had been hit head-on by a speeding truck, and he flew backward. The muscles on Huaishi's arm burst and quickly healed again. The broken skin healed again, and only a trace of blood-colored mist rose. Huaishi stepped forward. From the broken rocks, Horgus screamed and struggled to climb out, but then he felt his body rising up involuntarily. This was because a hand had already grabbed his head and pulled him up from the ground. It was as if someone had pulled out a carrot. His 5 fingers slowly tightened. His skull groaned in pain. Under the infusion of the ashes and deadly poison, Horgus screamed crazily and waved his chainsaw randomly, resisting without any pattern. But then, the screams turned into roars. This was because countless blood vessels suddenly extended out from the chainsaw and sank into his body. They crazily extracted his flesh and blood, making rumbling noises. The metal and bone chainsaw began to operate crazily. Eyes appeared on the back of the chainsaw, covered in blood vessels. They looked around randomly and finally landed on Huaishi. Horgus turned ghastly pale. His face was bloodless. Because the blood had turned into scarlet flames on the chainsaw, the glutton's chainsaw swung horizontally and collided with the axe of wrath. Sparks flew everywhere. "Eat, eat, I want to eat." In midair, Horgus twisted randomly like a spider. Ignoring the sound of his cervical vertebrae breaking, he broke free from Huaishi's shackles. He landed on the ground and crawled on his hands and feet. He was very fast. The glutton's chainsaw, which had fused into one, drilled into his bones and merged his entire arm into the chainsaw. The ghoul had been eroded by this ferocious border relic and turned into an inhuman, ferocious monster. It roared hoarsely at Huaishi. It was as if this could scare the enemy away. What answered it was the axe blade that cut down. With the friction of the enchanted gloves, the dark gray lightning formed by the qualitative change of the elemental substance adhered to it, and thunder burst out as Huaishi jumped and hacked. Amidst the rumbling, cracks appeared on the flying chain, and fine bone fragments splattered everywhere. Horgus hugged the axe blade without caring about his own safety, raised the chainsaw that had merged into his right arm, and hacked a Huaishi's face. The axe blade dissipated in an instant. The sacrificial knife was waved horizontally, wedged between the rotating blades. Then, the sword of virtue was raised and slashed forward. It tore through Horgus's chest like a hot knife through butter, opening up a huge gash. Stinking blood splattered everywhere. The deformed body flew backward, but then countless teeth emerged from the gash in his chest, and the deformed internal organs were flung out of the gash like long tongues. His entire chest cavity had become a hungry maw, and the chainsaw that had sunk into his body had turned into rapidly rotating teeth. His broken body suddenly propped itself up, and he lunged at Huaishur again. Frenzied hunting. Huaishur took a step back, and the lightning axe blade in his hand drew a nimble arc. He raised it and hacked at the monster that was pouncing at him. The crisp sound of a skull breaking rang out. Then the electric light spread, causing the body that the glutton's chainsaw parasitic to let out a paralyzed scream. With a wave of Huaishur's hand, the sacrificial knife wedged itself into the gaping mouth on Horgus's chest. It frantically extracted all the blood and energy, turning it into gorgeous reliefs and crystals on the blade. Flesh and blood withered. The sword of virtue was held upside down, raised, and stabbed down. It completely penetrated the monster's spine. The glutton's chainsaw let out a sharp scream. Countless eyes fell apart and were destroyed by the glimmer of light on the blade. At the last moment, Horgus's broken face raised with difficulty. His crooked eyes stared at Huaishur, full of resentment and fear. "What are you?" The messenger justice. Huaishur indifferently pulled out the blade and crushed the last trace of consciousness. The source form collapsed. The chainsaw ghoul met its end. In the dead silence, he looked around and asked expressionlessly, "Is there anything else?" The shadow under the grass and trees shook, but no one responded. "If there's nothing else, I'm leaving." Huaishur sneered, sheathed his sword, and turned to walk towards the white horse. The shadow wriggled as if it was angry, but when Huaishur looked back, it shrank back into the darkness like a frightened bird. Huaishur shook his head, bent down, and washed the blood off his face with the gurgling stream. He took the white horse's reins and continued to move forward. Before leaving, Ai Ching seemed to inadvertently turn back and glance at the unconscious Hupo on the ground. They left. After a long, long time, in the shadow of the grass and trees, a pale man slowly crawled out. After taking off the Shadow Realm breathing device from the corner of his mouth, he panted violently. He was drenched in sweat. Just now, he was almost killed. Damn it, for 100 million. Do you think you'll be alive to spend 400 million? The man looked down at the urging message on his phone and spat indignantly. After calling the agent who gave him this task and scolding him, he hung up the phone. The lingering fear still lingered. But soon, looking at the things scattered around, his eyes lit up again. No matter how small a mosquito was, it was still meat. He didn't come here for nothing. After stripping the dead people of their equipment, he turned back and looked at the unconscious girl on the ground. He rubbed his hands and couldn't help but gulp. His breathing quickened. "I guess you must have a bold idea." Hupa, who was supposed to be unconscious, suddenly opened his eyes and looked at him calmly. "I suggest you put away that bold idea, then put the things in your hands on the ground." The man was stunned for a moment. He picked up the things, turned around, and ran. Gunshots roared. He fell to the ground. Hupa expressionlessly put away a beautifully decorated flintlock gun, got up from the ground, and slowly picked up the equipment from the ground and piled them together. When she turned back to look at her lunchbox, she only saw the crushed remains and the rice balls that had fallen into the mud. "Cherish your food, bastard." She looked in the direction that Huaishur had left in, and she was furious. The phone rang from her pocket. "Hello, Chief. Yes, I've already fallen and almost died." Hupa tilted his head and lit a cigarette. He helplessly complained, "Why did you give me this kind of job that will only offend people? Isn't this the job of a temporary worker?" The eldest cousin on the phone laughed without any conscience. "Also, if third sister went, wouldn't the taste be completely different? After thinking about it, you're still the most suitable." Hoopa sighed and flicked the ash from his cigarette. "I'm not afraid of offending people, but is there any use? Things like hinting are fine as long as they fall. If you say too much, you'll end up being a topic of ridicule. That little girl is so smart, she'll definitely understand. Right? Who knows?" Hoopa shrugged. "Yes, who knows?" After a moment of silence, Zhu Hongchun couldn't help but sigh. "I hope nothing happens to that young man. I'll be scolded by old man Xin Yao for interfering with the Astronomy Association's matters. This really isn't worth it." Hoopa didn't respond to his words. He only smoked and quietly watched Huaishur and the others escape in the direction they left in. He suddenly asked, "Do you think he'll really give up?" The eldest cousin didn't reply. Everyone knew the answer, but no one wanted to see that kind of result. In the end, Zhu Hongchun could only sigh. "It's been hard on you, Hoopa. Isn't this the job of a temporary worker?" Hoopa smoked his cigarette with a salted fish expression. He shook his head and sighed. "But it's still so frustrating. Not only did the ultimate move I painstakingly came up with not being able to be put to use, but I couldn't even beat Huaishur. There's no justice in this world. Director, can you give this poor little Hoopa a raise on account of my mental trauma? Can you announce your praise and encourage everyone to learn from your achievements?" Pretend I didn't say anything. Hoopa curled his lips and unhappily hung up the phone. He quietly finished his cigarette and stamped it out. He picked up the spoils of war and turned around to leave. But as he walked, he couldn't help but turn around to look behind him. He didn't know if it was envy or pity. "Good luck, Your Highness," she softly muttered. "There really isn't much time left for you." Chapter 308. With the roar, the flames rose. Thick smoke covered the sun, and only the dancing red light illuminated every stunned face in the car window. Then, the white horse's neigh sounded from a distance. At the end of the highway, everyone saw a white figure as vigorous as a dragon running up and over the broken bridge. The iron hooves trampled and instantly crushed the broken window, crushing the grinning face. Blood splattered. Huaishur on the white horse raised his arm, and the force of the white horse gathered on his wrist. The spear of compassion stabbed forward, tearing the outside of the armored car like cutting paper and penetrating deeply into it. After leaving the iris seed, it dissipated in the air. On the road, the rampaging car suddenly turned around and tried to give chase again, but soon it gradually slowed down as it sped along. It was like a giant beast that was being bled. Finally, it stopped on the side of the road. The armored car suddenly shook and was buried in the sudden burst of flames. It was ignited by the spurting flames, blocking the cars behind it. Countless sharp horns brushed past him. On the highway, where the roaring sound came one after another, Huaishur pulled the reins and began to heroically go against the flow in the white horse's neigh. The iron hooves trampled and crushed the asphalt road under their feet. The white horse galloped like the wind. The long mane swayed in the wind, as fierce as a flag. "Be careful in front," Ai Ching behind him reminded in a low voice. And then there was the loud sound of a huge truck drifting and sweeping. Just in front, the heavy giant truck suddenly threw off the outer camouflage shell, revealing the body painted with scarlet graffiti. In a noisy rap, the driver in the driver's seat turned the steering wheel frantically, stepped on the brakes, and swept out the huge tail like a weapon. It was like a rough arm sweeping across a toy plate. After overturning a few cars in front, the horizontal body blocked the white horse's path. Then it slowly opened, revealing the heavy machine gun welded inside the cargo compartment. "Hey bro, try this." The dark-skinned machine gunner spat out the chewing gum in his mouth and pulled the trigger with a grin. As the bullet chain rolled, a loud roar burst out from his hand. The red-hot metal whizzed out, tearing through the air. Like an endless whip of thunder and fire, it instantly swept towards Huaishur. Then he saw the appearance of the white horse leaping into the air. It was as if he was really flying in the wind. His speed was so fast that even the turning speed of the machine guns could not catch up to him. In just a few seconds, he had crossed a distance of more than 100 meters. The iron hooves stepped on the carriage. Looking at the dumbfounded face, the white horse snorted disdainfully and spat on the ground in an extremely human-like manner. Immediately afterward, the axe on the horse's back swept horizontally. After cutting off the entire top of the head, it also cut the machine gun that was still firing in the air into two. In the midst of the broken bullets, the white horse turned around and swept the pike of compassion, cutting the shell of the car with irresistible force and sending the two border war wild dogs next to it to the underworld. The explosion of the primordial substance flashed and disappeared. AI Ching put down her hand. Through the thick armor, a figure that had pounced on her flew backward, his head on the ground. "They're all small fries. Don't get entangled with them," she said. "It should be the Eye of Nightmare. Those guys like to use cannon fodder to exhaust the strength of their prey before easily capturing them." Following her words, the white horse jumped out from the torn shell of the car again and landed on the ground. It nimbly jumped on the roofs of the cars and finally jumped up and stepped on the overpass. When he turned around, the highway behind him was already in a mess. As the flames spread, thick smoke billowed. The sight of the corpses of the wild dogs of war everywhere was enough to make the coldest white leftists feel heartache. Fortunately, thanks to the Social Security Bureau's extremely quick response and traffic control, this area had been sealed off. None of the people who barged in were innocent. Then a roar came from the sky. Before that, a scarlet light lit up in the dark clouds that could not be dispelled in the sky. The winding curve outlined a blood-red eye symbol. Then, a huge steel ship broke out of the clouds. It was a distant illusion. The exploration ship, which was installed with the latest deep-diving engine, broke into the gap of the present realm from the closest border transit station. It maintained a safe distance from the external defense of the Dongxia system and only opened the door to the present realm by a sliver. Then, the light of a catapult flashed in the cabin that slowly opened. Thus, in the distant illusion, real steel fell from the sky. It rubbed against the air and burst out with blazing flames. Meteors fell. The frenzied roar spread in all directions. Then, a stream of flames spewed out from the falling piece of iron. Like a rocket landing, pieces of iron were constantly thrown off from the body and fell into the wind. They burned into scarlet liquid iron and scattered in all directions. In the end, the heavy iron shell finally fell from the sky and collapsed with a bang. The overpass shook violently. The sharp sound of steel rubbing against each other rang out. The burly figure, half kneeling in it, slowly raised his head. Only a pair of gray eyes could be seen on his face that was covered by a ferocious helmet. The newcomer's entire body was wrapped in well-tempered, full-body armor. He held a flame-shaped sword and a dueling shield that were too heavy for ordinary people. He took a step forward with ease. He showed Huaishur the eye-shaped symbol on the shield. It represented the arrival of one of the most famous border mercenary groups in the border in hell, the Eye of Nightmare. Although it's a little unfair to compete with an opponent who has experienced such a battle, I hope you can understand, the Iron Knight said in a muffled voice. This means war. Huaishur dismounted and looked around. Finally, he raised his eyes to look at the illusory shadow in the sky. He was full of doubts. If it's just you alone, it can't be considered war, right? I'm the one who made the request. The descender, shrouded in steel, said, "If I can solve this bounty alone, then the army commander will personally put the Eye of Nightmare on my shield." Beside his hand, the Eye of Nightmare symbol was empty on the dueling shield that was big enough to block his entire body. It represented his identity as an immature. Only those who were personally bestowed the Eye of Nightmare emblem by the army commander could become an official member of this hell army. Before that, no matter how long they served, no matter what kind of war they participated in, or how many enemies they reaped, if their ability was not proven and not recognized, then they would never be able to get rid of this mark that represented childishness and weakness. If you still insist on not retreating, then bring it on, young man. The ascendant from the abyss raised his flame-shaped sword and solemnly declared, "Under the witness of this eye, you and I will fight. No one will interfere, and there will be no other outcome. We will not rest until one of us is dead. If you defeat me, it means that my trial has failed, and the Eye of Nightmare will no longer interfere in this matter. I'll go over, but unfortunately, the horse is being ridden by someone else. It's not convenient to use it." Huaishur shrugged indifferently and stepped forward step by step. He raised his voice and asked, "How should I address you?" "What I mean is, I can at least set up a tombstone for you later." "Richard," he said, "Richard the Exiled." The level 3 sublimator reported his name and revealed the aura that was bound in his body. The phantom of a griffin rose from behind him. At that moment, the iron boots shattered the concrete under his feet. The dueling shield shook and pushed forward with a loud bang. Like a war chariot, when the inhuman body under the armor began to exert force, a violent force burst out from it, pushing the heavy armor that weighed 100 kilograms forward with a loud bang. It stirred up a whistling hurricane. Huaishir retreated step by step, pushed by the violent force on the shield. 2 cracks appeared in the broken concrete under his feet, and he felt the terrifying force contained in the short collision. His hand went numb. Against such an enemy, he should use the method he was best at to fight and exhaust him. With his speed, Richard would definitely not be able to catch up. But now he could not escape. If he kept retreating, Richard, who had lost his patience, would attack AI Qing directly. He could not retreat. Then he would use the method of not retreating. He took a deep breath, and his face flushed red. Then it instantly turned pale, and a trace of ashen color appeared. The hot sweat evaporated into mist, rising from his bare hands and face. Amidst the wisps of white, his muscles were trembling crazily. It was as if they had been burned red. Huaishir let out a long sigh and exhaled the burning breath in his lungs. The flames of the mountain ghost rose from the crack in his chest and enveloped his body once again. The advancement of the shield came to an abrupt stop, before Huaishir raised her hand and spread her fingers. Behind the armor, Richard raised his eyes in surprise and immediately came to a realization. Is this the move that was displayed in the rookie competition? An awe-inspiring skill. The flame-shaped sword slashed down with a whistling sound. As Huaishir dodged, a deep crack appeared in the ground. Then, as Richard waved, the heavy long sword slapped on the shield. Sparks flew. It was like the sound of marching drums. You are indeed a strong opponent who can fight with me. Richard stared at Huaishir in front of him with anticipation. Come, your highness. Victory or death. In the long howl of the griffin, its wings spread out, and a bright glow enveloped Richard's armor. The enemy stepped forward, attacking the burning mountain ghost. What responded to him was the saber and axe in Huaishir's hands. The friction caused blazing sparks to burst out. It scattered toward the flame-shaped sword that was slashing down. The sharp sound of steel colliding burst out again. Huaishir took a step back, but this time he was not destroyed by the terrifying power. With the mountain ghost sacred mark that could constantly repair the body and temporarily sacrifice the body to increase the power beyond the limit state, Huaishir's muscle strength finally entered the 3rd stage, the realm of ether. He could feel the violent power surging in his pulse like lava. The mountain ghost grinned, and the axe in his hand changed. He pulled out the sword of virtue and rushed forward. Again. Chapter 309. The mountain ghost suddenly lost its sense of reality. It was as if it had turned into rising smoke. When a mountain ghost collided with the griffin, its form became more and more ethereal. Even Huaishir felt as if he was about to evaporate as the divine mark operated. It turned from a solid to a formless liquid, and then quickly turned into a drifting mist. Perhaps this was some kind of drawback or danger, but for some reason, he felt an indescribable joy in his heart. It was as if he had grown again. This was how it should be. This was how it should be. From one to many, and then from many to one. In the end, it completely returned to nothingness. The boundless vitality within the origin substance began to gradually condense as it was drained away. The season slowly moved from midsummer to winter. After tossing aside the meaningless restlessness, it slowly began to plant its roots into the ground, waiting for spring to come. After being given life from death, the mountain ghost instinctively wanted to return to death. And now, death was close at hand. The flame-shaped sword covered in frost slashed down, colliding with the lightning on the virtuous sword. Huaishir took a step back, turned around, and deftly dispelled the terrifying power on the blade. As he spun, the blade of an axe appeared. As his hand swept across it, the lightning on the enchanted glove lit up the blade. Huaishir raised his wrist and chopped down at the Griffin Knight's neck. Bang! The dueling shield suddenly shook, and deep cracks appeared on it. Lightning spread, bringing about an instant of paralysis. Huaishir took another step forward, resisting the cold around Richard's body. The sacrificial knife appeared in his hand, and it pierced through the gaps in the armor. But then, as Richard roared, the sacrificial knife was suddenly clamped down and twisted. It broke. The impact of the origin substance breaking made Huaishir's vision go black. Then he saw the flame-shaped sword in Richard's hand suddenly disintegrate. No, it should be said that under the power of his soul, it gathered into a beam of origin substance fire and slashed at his face. This was an ability that was similar to the sealing hand. After the flaming sword was transformed into origin substance, it was able to bind the origin substance within the outline of the blade, creating a violent, fleeting attack. After expending a weapon, he would instantly gain 10 times more power than before. Chop! Huaishir hurriedly retreated, using the Emperor Yu's steps. He felt as if his tendons were about to be torn apart. A sharp gash appeared on the front of his gray windbreaker, and the origin substance within it had been deeply dented. The hallucinatory pain had already been engraved into his heart. If it wasn't for this light armor, Huaishir would have been severely injured in an instant. But when Huaishir retreated to the limit and almost couldn't feel his feet anymore, the power he had accumulated suddenly erupted. It was like the rebound of a spring that had been compressed to the limit. Huaishir ignored the embers of the origin substance sword and leapt forward. The spear of compassion suddenly appeared in his pale green hands and pierced forward. A mournful shriek rang out. Richard didn't panic, as if he had expected this. After the dueling shield, he pulled out a heavy longsword and blocked in front of him. In the next instant, the long spear pierced through. With one strike, it actually broke through his well-trained defensive stance. He had to retreat. He instinctively raised his heavy shield, wanting to react, but he didn't expect. Huaishir was already right in front of him. The long spear in his hand had at some point transformed into an axe covered in electric light. It was aimed at his neck and suddenly chopped down. Two mournful cries overlapped, forming a perfect chord. The faceplate cracked. Countless steel fragments flew out, and the third note rang out from the spine of the Sword of Virtue. Richard subconsciously opened his eyes wide. He saw the expressionless youth raise the blade, as if time had frozen, inch by inch, piercing through the cracks in the armor. Wedged into the neck, swung horizontally, and so the headless knight fell backwards. Only a head flew into the air, blood splattering everywhere. Dead. Death came suddenly, but the flagship of the Eye of Nightmare in the sky did not react. It quietly watched the outcome of the battle, witnessing the immature receive death. The battle ended. At that moment, the figure hidden in the void suddenly leaped out. The assassin, who had been lurking for a long time, crossed hundreds of feet in one step. That instant of explosive power was even above Huaishir's step. He stabbed the dark green dagger in his hand at Huaishir's back. It pierced through Huaishir's chest and protruded from his chest. A stream of sticky, poisonous blood dripped down. Huaishir raised his hand expressionlessly and threw the invisible axe behind him. In his shadow, the ghost jumped out and grabbed the axe blade that was spinning in the air. It slashed at the assassin behind Huaishir, cut at the waist. The screaming body fell to the ground and was cut into two tragic halves. Huaishir reached out and pulled out half of the dagger. He left the other half, which was soaked in poison, at his back. He took the axe blade from the red gloves and stepped on the assassin's chest. "Goodbye," he whispered to the back of the knife, and the axe blade fell. The scream stopped abruptly. The indifferent youth raised his head and looked into the distance. On the distant railway, on the roof of the speeding train, the sniper, who had been crawling on the ground for a long time, looked away from the scope as if he had been electrocuted. He was intimidated by the almost tangible darkness in his eyes. The fleeting opportunity had slipped away from his hands just like that. He didn't dare to look anymore. He immediately threw the sniper rifle into the river beside him and crawled back into the carriage. He returned to his position and became an unrelated tourist again. Huaishir retracted his gaze and waited for a while. After no one came to challenge him again, he turned around and walked towards the white horse. He saw a corpse that had been kicked to pieces beside the white horse. Who is this? I don't know. AI Ching shook her head. He's probably here to take advantage of the situation. Huaisher nodded and pulled out the remaining half of the dagger. He threw it on the ground and applied a layer of silver blood potion on it. He looked up and asked, "How far is it?" 80 kilometers. It's not far. AI Ching asked, "Are we still going?" "Then let's go." Huaisher got on the horse and looked at the gradually gloomy sky in front of him. In the darkness, there were faint flashes of lightning and thunder, illuminating the young man's pitch-black eyes. However, the darkness was empty, reflecting the fleeting lightning and emitting a faint metallic glow. He said, "Let's continue." So they continued. They walked down the highway and went forward. They saw the canyon between the mountains and the bridge above the canyon. A stooped figure stood on the bridge, emitting a foul smell. But in his hands, he held a large scythe that looked exaggerated compared to his monkey-like body. The bone-white scythe was full of gaps, making people feel cold just by looking at it. And under the disheveled hair, a pair of eyes that were less black than white burned red the moment he saw them. After a strange cry, he pounced straight at them. Both of his legs were actually reversed joints. Rather than a person, it was better to say that he was like a beast. Bang! The sweeping scythe blade stopped abruptly in front of Huaisher. On the white horse, the sword of virtue was pressed against the handle of the scythe. Huaisher slowly raised his eyes and stared at his blood-red eyes. "Just you?" The monkey-like strange person did not speak. He still screamed, raised the scythe in his hand, and slashed again. But the white horse stood up like a human and abruptly kicked at him with its hooves. The enemy flew out, but before he landed, Huaisher had already appeared in front of him. The blade slashed down, and an arm flew up. In the spurt of blood, another arm popped out of the wound and suddenly grabbed Huaisher's face, gouging out 2 bloody marks. The scythe wielder's legs fell to the ground. The scythe swept across, and the sharp sound of steel rubbing against each other sounded. Lightning flashed, and the blade of the axe chopped down. The bone-white scythe broke. The strange person opened his mouth to scream, but saw Huaisher coming forward. The sacrificial knife in his hand nailed into his mouth, sucking his blood crazily. In an instant, the dirty face withered. The next moment, the blade of the axe was raised and chopped down. The head flew out. The enemy fell to the ground. Worried about the terrifying regenerative ability, Huaisher waved his hand, threw down a pack of metal fuel, and snapped his fingers. Flames rose into the sky. In the raging fire, the monkey-like strange person struggled crazily, screaming, and in the end was completely burned to ashes. All that was left was a withered head, its eyes wide open as it stared fixedly at Huaisher. Huaisher raised the axe and chopped it. Dead. He raised his hand, wiped the wounds on his face with the silver blood potion, and looked into the distance. 70 kilometers. He turned around and led the white horse. "Let's go." "Okay." AI Ching nodded. They continued to move forward. On a distant mountain, 2 people in black suits stared at everything here with binoculars. When they saw that the monster they sent out was killed so easily, they could not help but frown. Not fast enough. The speed is enough, but the skill is not good enough. There are too many beasts integrated. There's still one backup. Do you want to continue? The actual combat practice is to find flaws. Once the flaws are found, there's no need to get involved. Then let's go. Okay. They picked up the briefcase beside them and turned to leave. Huaisher was still moving forward. 52 kilometers away, outside Mingwang town, he saw a huge beast crawling at the foot of the mountain. It had 8 arthropods like a spider, and its whole body was covered with heavy steel armor. Venom slowly dripped from its mouth. The violent chemical toxin melted the stones into liquid, and a pungent stench spread. On its back, a woman with dense tattoos on her skin raised her eyes, holding a hook-like spear and a dagger in her hands. Seeing the arrival of Huaisher and the others, she slowly raised the weapons in her hand. "I've cleaned up the surroundings. Don't worry about your woman. she said in choppy Dongxiao language. Bring it on. Although she's not anyone's woman, thank you anyway. Huaisher smiled and threw the sacrificial knife to the red gloves, asking him to guard Ai Qing. After standing a little further away, he raised the spear of compassion in his hand and clenched it. Without warning, a large dark green net was spat out from the spider-like beast's mouth. Its sharp knife feet trampled on the ground, whistling toward Huaisher. The spear of compassion was raised. From the fragrance of iris flowers, a dim electric light lit up, reflecting the sudden burst of thunder in the sky above his head. It stabbed forward. The white horse neighed, moved forward, and walked into the net. Then, with a fierce piercing, the entire net and restraint were torn apart, and the horse brazenly crashed into the spider-like beast. The long hook and the spear of compassion collided in the air, creating sparks. At the moment of intersection, the woman swung the dagger in her hand horizontally. It was as fast as lightning. Huaisher couldn't stop it in time. He didn't want to stop it. In his hand, the axe blade slashed down again, smashing the spider-like beast's helmet with irresistible force. Its head was smashed into pieces. The dagger slashed across his throat, tearing apart the collar of his windbreaker, leaving behind a wound so deep that the bone could be seen. But then, the crack healed as Huaisher's palm wiped it, forcibly reconnecting it. At the moment when the mount was hacked to death, the rider couldn't help but stagger. Then, she saw Huaisher's sword of virtue pierce through her on the saddle. Her lungs were torn apart. The woman with tattoos all over her face seemed to feel no pain. The long hook in her hand suddenly softened, entangling Huaisher like a snake, and the dagger in her other hand stabbed again. Bang! The axe of fury swept across, shattering the softened long hook. With irresistible force, it cut the dagger into pieces along with her arm. Then, he raised his arm, and the blade of the axe drew an arc and chopped down. Cut! The two sides crossed each other, and blood spurted out. From Huaisher's chest to the rider's shoulder. The white horse ran forward for a while, then turned back to look at Huaisher. Huaisher patted its neck, and it snorted, then trotted back to where she had come from. Ai Qing raised her head and stared at the deep wound on Huaisher's chest. Her expression didn't change, and she just asked, Continue. Huaisher answered calmly, reached out, and pulled her onto the horse's back. They continued forward. In the increasingly dense thunder, the distant sky gradually darkened. It was going to rain. 50 kilometers to go. Chapter 310. Triple Suspect, You're Under Arrest. In the solemn atmosphere of the conference room, the young man on the big screen who was dancing with a trident took the lead and raised his spear. Suddenly, he burst out from the crowd, and his spear shot out like a dragon, piercing a middle-aged man with glasses to the ground. Without waiting for the commotion to spread, 4 or 5 ascendants who had been waiting for a long time pounced forward and put on shackles and shackles. Then, they hammered a silver nail to the neck and pinned this notorious wanted criminal to the ground, skillfully and deftly capturing him alive. Immediately after, someone clapped his hands before the crowd could react, smiled, and used a wide-area hypnosis and suggestion, asking everyone to pretend that nothing had happened. Very quickly, the triple suspect was stuffed into a van headed directly to Jixia and disappeared from the screen. On the various screens on the big screen, more than 6 teams were moving at top speed, continuously capturing or killing the sublimators who had snuck into the reality according to the plan. As the eldest cousin tapped his fingers on the table, the countdown continued like a symphony. Dozens of tense and chaotic arrests were carried out in an orderly manner within a quarter of an hour, then arrested one criminal after another without any mistakes. Team B can start moving now. He turned around and said to his assistant, Let Team D wait for a while. Rank 4 is a bit tricky. Call Kwafu, we'll send out the longbow guards. The Knight of Doom and the Blade of Annihilation rarely dare to show themselves in the reality. Don't let them think that they're here for a vacation. Doom, who was already used to the assistant's work, nodded. He was about to say something when he saw Zhu Hongqin's expression become serious, as if he was thinking. Outside the meeting room, Hurried footsteps could be heard. Immediately after, someone pushed open the door and entered. Sorry, there was a bit of traffic on the way. The Mouth of Hunger 3-star milk tea you ordered has arrived. Please sign here and give us a good review later. Thank you. The mysterious delivery man from yesterday's delivery service stuck his arm out from behind the door, a string of milk tea takeout bags hanging from his arm. Zhu Hongshun immediately beamed with joy. Well said, well said. There's a barbecue later. Please hurry up. After sending the delivery man away, Big Cousin skillfully distributed the milk tea to everyone's speechless expression. As he sipped his abyss milk tea with double sugar and pearls, he looked up at the arrest list displayed on the screen and sighed. 1, 2, 17. Aya, how many third-class merits are there? There are even 2 second-class merits. This is great, this is great. He thought for a moment and came up with a bold idea. The Ascendant with slightly gray hair suggested, this time, it's obvious that we can't handle alone. Why don't we work together? If you trust me, then we'll split the money according to our contributions. I'll send the dead people's share to their magic gold bank account. Those who agree, come to my side. At this time, whether it was a good decision or a bad decision, it was precious. There was nothing more irritating than silence and hesitation. It couldn't be better if someone stood up and was willing to take responsibility. Soon, 3 slightly sparse lines of defense were set up at the entrance of the stone city. This section of the ancient city wall was built with the back of the Black Lake in the distance. They waited for the sound of horse hooves to approach, until a blood-stained knight riding a scarlet warhorse slowly walked out of the abandoned train tunnel. In the dead silence, the knight on the horse's back, who was almost dyed red, was revealed in front of everyone. He was already covered in bruises. His face was covered in blood, and he no longer looked as handsome and feminine as the information said. There was only a heart-palpitating calmness. Viscous blood dripped from the gorgeous and cold spear blade, falling into the soil. Wherever it passed, clusters of pure white irises bloomed. The heavily injured white horse neighed and slowly moved forward with the silent knight on its back. It was as if it would fall dead on the spot at any time. It was hard to believe that people could still be alive at this level, but in fact there were still blazing breaths coming out of their mouths and noses. Their bloodshot eyes carried the temperature of hell's lava. Even though it was so tragic, the girl behind the knight was spotless and didn't suffer any injuries. Because no one could pass in front of him, the scarlet white horse raised its eyes and stared coldly at the enemies in front of it, slowly moving forward. The knight was still silent. The distance slowly closed, and everyone saw the wounds and blood on Huaishi's body. In the silence, their expressions twitched, and they exchanged glances with each other, until the commander with gray hair slowly stood up, put out the cigarette at the corner of his mouth, and sighed softly. He stood up and shouted at the knight. "Huaishi, is it?" No one answered. In the silence, the white horse still moved forward, neither fast nor slow. Its cracked iron hooves hit the stone, bursting into sparks. Like the beating of a drum, it shook everyone's heart. "There's no need for this," the commander said loudly. "No one can blame you anymore after you've done this. Even if you die, you can't rush over. Why don't we talk?" Still, no one spoke. Huaishi lowered his eyes and didn't respond, as if he didn't hear it. But then, the sound of iron hooves trampling became denser. The horse's hooves hit the rusty iron track, reflecting the thunder that suddenly crossed the sky. Lightning lashed down from the dark clouds and disappeared in a flash, illuminating the pair of pitch-black eyes. It was cold and indifferent like cast iron. The white horse galloped forward, letting out a furious neigh. Huaishi roared. The hoarse roar of the mountain ghost suddenly burst out, followed by the sound of thunder. On the galloping white horse, the spear of compassion was raised and aimed at the old and stunned face. There was a roar of gunfire, but in an instant, the insignificant bullets were shaken off by the white horse. Huaishi was moving forward. The last kilometer. Chapter 311. At that moment, the blood-stained white horse rushed into the frontmost defensive position. The long spear pierced straight through, tearing the frontmost face and piercing through the outermost defensive line like a hot knife through butter. The alchemy bomb that fell from the horse's back immediately buried everything in the sweeping fire and roar. Huaishir was still moving forward. The white horse leaped over the trenches and sharp iron spikes on the ground. The iron hooves trampled and blood spurted out. Huaishir, who was on the horse, swept the blade of the spear and casually chopped the axe to the left. Blood and bone shattered. In the tragic sound, a corpse fell on its back, and blood splashed. Then, more death suddenly came. Chaotic roars and screams sounded, but then they were annihilated under the cruel ravages. The iron hooves trampled, and the white horse moved forward step by step, breaking through the second line of defense. The old commander didn't even have time to react. The blood-stained knight had already rushed over, and the axe wrapped in electric light swept across, smashing the barrier of nothingness with irresistible force. The white horse stood up on its hind legs and crushed his weapon. It neighed loudly and set off a bloody storm that had arrived late. A pitch-black shotgun was raised from the horse's back, and it was aimed at the commander's face. "Talk!" At the last moment, he heard a hoarse sneer from the horse's back. "Do you deserve to talk?" The trigger was pulled. The gushing metal rain brought death and darkness, indicating the beginning of the final battle. And there was no more obstruction in front of him. Huaishir looked back, and his blood-stained eyes quietly stared at the pursuers behind him who didn't have time to disperse. Once again, he raised the blade of the spear in his hand. With the final thunder, the torrential rain fell from the sky, swallowing the last screams and wails. After a long, long time, when Huaishir numbly pulled out the blade of the spear from the corpse, he looked around and couldn't see anyone else. There were no more enemies here. He gasped with relief. He felt the white horse stagger and kneel in the mud on the ground. Its head, which was covered in wounds and blood, slowly turned to look at him for the last time. After pushing his shoulder, it turned into a phantom and dissipated. In the torrential rain, Huaishir got up from the ground, stretched out his hand, and supported Ai Qing. They slowly walked to the broken city gate in front of them. After passing through the broken city wall and the broken city gate, they would be able to enter the border stone city. But Ai Qing's footsteps came to an abrupt halt. She stopped in place. Huaishir looked back blankly and saw her calm eyes. "Once you enter the border, you will be considered a traitor. Do you understand?" Ai Qing said. Tian will not allow such a degree of dereliction of duty and rebellion. Huaishir did not answer. He knew. Ai Qing thought and asked, "What do you plan to do after going to the border? Will anyone accept me? There will only be more people waiting inside. Maybe Inya is there waiting for us to come to him. Are you sure you can beat him?" Huaishir did not answer. He did not know. Ai Qing stared at him silently. After a long time, she asked the last question, "Do you think I didn't think of what you would do after coming to the Yin family and encountering such a thing?" Huaishir did not answer. He did not know if he knew. "I'm using you." "Huaishir," Ai Qing asked, "is it really necessary to do this for this kind of woman? You know I won't leave it alone, right?" Huaishir smiled and replied in a calm tone that made her extremely unhappy. "Knowing how to rely on friends is a sign of your growth, isn't it? There's no need to care about other things." Speaking of making use of others, hadn't he made use of Ai Qing and the Astronomy Association more often than not? They were friends when they were young, but it was said that there were only pros and cons in the adult world. It was not bad to be good friends who could use each other. Why do you have to be so stubborn? He grabbed Ai Qing's hand and continued to move forward. He heard the girl's doubtful voice behind him. "Huaishir, don't tell me you're in love." Huaishir turned around and was stunned for a long time. He was amused by her serious tone and could not help but shake his head. "Don't be ridiculous. Who would fall in love with a woman like you?" "Yes, then I'm relieved." Ai Qing sighed softly. "But even if I don't care, I still can't help but feel angry when people say that." As she spoke, she reached out and pressed Huaishir's neck. A small amount of anger and unhappiness exploded on her fingertips. There was a soft slap. The last straw fell. The exhausted camel was finally overwhelmed. Huaishur fell on his back, but soon he was supported by Ai Qing. She supported Huaishur forward and walked to a place under the city gate where the rain could not reach. She put him down and leaned against the wall. "Don't you understand, Huaishur?" Ai Qing looked at his stunned expression, shook her head, and sighed. "Now, I'm your last stumbling block." No one needed Huaishur to take revenge anymore. But as long as she was still around, Huaishur would always be entangled with the hatred of the past and the Yin family. Only when Ai Qing was gone could he be completely free, to live the life he wanted. "There's no need to be so surprised, right?" She suddenly laughed. "If there's anything you taught me, it's that I have to do my own things. Now it seems that I'm doing well. Why do you continue to interfere?" Huaishur was stunned. It was the first time he saw Ai Qing smile. It was calm and warm, no longer gloomy, but with the taste of sunshine. She was already free. From a moment, she broke free from the bondage. But for some reason, he remembered what the muscular old man said to him a few days ago. "Are you mistaken, Huaishur? Not everyone will fall into the abyss of misfortune after leaving your help. Why do you have to make everyone unable to leave you?" Huaishur shook his head and couldn't help but want to laugh. "Yes, why do you insist on being a hero everywhere? Not every girl persistently hopes for a Prince Charming to fall from the sky. Huaishur, not everyone thinks that there will be a savior who will solve everything neatly. Your Highness, times have changed. Instead of waiting for a prince who works sometimes, they may prefer to solve things themselves. Maybe after they pick up the Gatling gun, they can still hold a cigarette in their mouth and ask the late prince to light it. Since when did the soft and fragrant ladies become such terrifying creatures? It's really hard to accept from the bottom of my heart. It's too sad to talk like that, Ai Qing." Huaishur coughed and laughed at himself. "I originally wanted to be friends with you. Forget it, I hate you very much." Ai Qing gently sat beside him and glanced at him. "From the first time I saw you, I hated you. I didn't understand why my mother liked you so much. When I saw you won second place in the cello competition and still didn't care about it, I hated you even more. From that time on, I didn't want to be friends with this kind of muddling through people. I didn't expect that we would be entangled until now." She glanced at Huaishur with pity. "You can think of it as an ill-fated relationship." "Ill-fated? It's not bad to have more ill-fated relationships like this." Huaishur smiled and didn't say anything. He just quietly looked at the pouring rain outside the city gate. In the heavy sound of the endless rain, the whole world was quiet. The roaring and cruel world gradually moved away from them. They were left in the same place. In the speechless silence, everything became unimportant. Whether it was stubbornness or grudges, they all drifted like water vapor, dissipating in the long silence. But only now, he suddenly felt that Ai Qing was real. She was not the lonely phantom in the memory fragments of the past, nor was she the woman who was obsessed with higher things, who made people feel unreachable. She really existed in this world. She was right beside him, only a short distance away. He could even hear her heartbeat and breathing. In the silence, they seemed to be no longer lonely. They were freed from the shadows and resentment of the past, and accompanied each other in this cruel world, even if it was only for a short moment, until the pouring rain gradually became thinner. Ai Qing slowly got up from the ground and looked into the distance. "Are you ready to go?" "Yes." She nodded. "Don't you have anything to say to me?" Huaishur looked at her. After he finished speaking, he thought for a while and added, for example, a parting word, a suggestion, or a farewell and regret. "If you want to apologize, it's not too late." "Apologize? Are you dreaming?" Ai Qing coldly extinguished his fantasy. After thinking for a while, she said seriously, "If there's really any advice, it's to learn to be more ruthless. Don't be a good person, but don't be too bad either." She said, "Don't become like me." Seeing Huaishur's stunned look, she shook her head and laughed. "From 9 years ago until today, I've been thinking about how to get more power and status, how to find other people's weaknesses, how to take revenge on those who suppress me, should this kind of life be described as bleak or fulfilling. I don't understand it all, but there's only one thing I can be sure of. AI Ching said seriously. The past few hours have been the most free time of my life. She lowered her head and stared into the young man's eyes. She said solemnly, "Thank you, Huaisher." Huaisher was stunned for a long time. He coughed dryly and couldn't help but look away. "If you really want to thank me, can you stay and be my slave to repay me?" "Stop dreaming, Huaisher. In stories, isn't that usually a matter of the next life?" She took a step back, as if she was preparing to leave after work, and told him calmly, "Goodbye, Huaisher." She turned and walked into the rain. Step by step, she walked into the rain. When she saw the sneaky shadows that lingered behind the curtain of rain and didn't dare to approach, she showed her trademark mocking smile and looked away with disdain. She stood still in the lonely rain. "I surrender myself here." AI Ching raised her head and said to the empty sky, except for the dark clouds, "Everything Huaisher does is under my orders and commands. He's just fulfilling his duty." At that moment, the rain stopped abruptly. It was as if the world had frozen at that moment. Countless raindrops that fell hastily hung in the air, illuminated by the sudden appearance of a fierce light in the void. Dazzling lights burst out from the void, piercing through the rain and enveloping AI Ching's body. It was as if countless suns had risen in an instant in the rain and fog. Under the illumination of countless suns, the shadow of a huge building silently slid out of the void and stood on this desolate and muddy land. In the blink of an eye, even the mud had dried up, turning into a firm and neat grassland. And on top of the gray wall, in the midst of countless dazzling lights, the symbol of the Astronomy Society hung solemnly, overlooking the sinners who had reined in their horses at the edge of the cliff. The cold aura spread in all directions, intimidating all the fanatics who dared to have evil intentions. It issued a stern warning without any mercy. Either don't move, or die. Thus, no one dared to step forward. Only two black-clothed men wearing sunglasses came forward, as if they had been waiting for a long time. They looked at AI Ching, then looked up at Huaisher, who had fallen under the city gate, and softly asked a few questions. After AI Ching answered, they nodded, took out handcuffs, and handcuffed AI Ching's wrists. "Madam AI Ching, the Ministry of Justice has evaluated and reviewed the laws you have violated. You will be temporarily detained, and your trial will be held in a week." After showing her the document with the seal of the Astronomy Society and the signature of the Ministry of Justice, the leading black-clothed man asked, "Do you have anything else to say?" "No, I believe the Astronomy Society will give me a fair judgment." AI Ching calmly shook her head, then said, "But before that, can you give me a blanket? I'm a little cold." Soon, a thin and warm blanket appeared in the hands of the female black-clothed man and covered AI Ching's shoulders. "Is this okay?" she asked. AI Ching nodded, turned around, and followed them to the door that suddenly opened without any resistance. Finally, she heard a shout behind her. "Wait a minute." At some point, Huaisher had crawled up from the ground. He used the sword of virtue to support his body and shouted at AI Ching with all his might. "Wait a minute." AI Ching, panting heavily, Huaisher stared at her back and said with all his strength, "One more question. I have one more question to ask you." There was one more question that he had to ask. He was afraid that if he didn't ask now, he wouldn't have a chance in the future. But when AI Ching turned around, he fell into silence. His lips moved, but he couldn't speak. The two black-clothed men didn't seem to be in a hurry. They were tolerant of this kind of thing. Or rather, after witnessing everything from the beginning to the end, they looked at Huaisher with eyes full of admiration and sympathy. It was just a few minutes. They could afford to wait. AI Ching calmly looked at Huaisher's red face. She was waiting for his question. She seemed to have prepared the cruelest answer. Huaisher hesitated for a long time. He finally mustered up his courage and asked loudly, "Where did you, by the divine light of grace?" In the dead silence, AI Ching was stunned. The words that she was about to blurt out were stuck in her throat. After a long time, she finally reacted. Her shoulders couldn't help but shake, and she chuckled. It was not only self-deprecating, but also helpless. She should be angry, but for some reason, there was an indescribable helplessness. I really do hate you. Why sure? She took one last look at Why sure, turned around, and disappeared into the darkness behind the door. I hate you the most in the world. The door closed behind her with a loud bang. The dazzling sun and the emblem of the Astronomical Association disappeared together with the huge and cold building. Only the gradually exhausted rain dripped weakly from the sky. Huaisher staggered back and leaned against the wet wall. What? He chuckled softly and shook his head. You don't even want to send me a link? Isn't it too cold? No one answered. Through the thin curtain of rain and gradually dissipating dark clouds, he saw the distant sun gradually sink into the curtain of night. In the clear dusk, fleeting starlight lit up in the dusky sky. The rain was about to stop. He closed his eyes tiredly. Then, he felt the rain on his face stop abruptly. There was a black umbrella over his head. A passing cowherd looked down at his helpless and embarrassed appearance and laughed gloatingly. Yo, young man, are you heartbroken? Huaisher rolled his eyes at him, thought for a while, and suddenly asked, Are you free? He said, Let's go for a drink. It's my treat. Okay. Dongri smiled and reached out to pull him up from the ground. Let's go. But have you thought of a toast? To death, how about that? Not bad. Anything else? To freedom. Huaisher took one last look at the direction where Ai Qing left, chuckled softly, and walked forward. He said, I'm free. Chapter 3:12. When she woke up, she saw a white ceiling. The smell of disinfectant echoed with the monotonous ticking of the instrument. Luo Xian raised her eyes in confusion and heard hurried footsteps outside the door. The awakened doctors pushed the door in and gave her a comprehensive examination. They didn't miss anything. Then, they were puzzled to find that the originally weakened soul seemed to have been reborn from a cocoon, but it wasn't damaged or better than before. There was no change. Nothing more, nothing less. Although they couldn't find any reason to explain this situation, there was no way to dissect or do any in-depth research. Some people wanted to give it a try under the ban, but after being glanced at by the old man who was leaning against the wall, they obediently gave up on this bold idea. In the end, they could only leave with the conclusion that everything was normal. Only the father and daughter were left in the ward. Elder Luo blew a breath and closed the door. Finally, he looked at his daughter, who had woken up. He looked at her carefully for a long time and shook his head in confusion. It feels like nothing has changed. Yeah, it seems to be the same as before. Luo Xian looked down at her hands. She didn't seem to care about everything that happened to her. It was just difficult to understand. The characteristics of the abyss still remained in her, but the human part didn't decline at all. She wasn't reborn as a human, but she didn't die as a monster either. The two sides mixed together again in an unpleasant way, but this time there were no benefits like before. After losing the strengths of both sides, all the flaws of both sides were retained. Without the brutality and cruelty of the abyss, she was given the weakness and limitations of a human. Was this a success or a failure? No matter how she rejected the past and how much effort and determination she put into it, at best, it just changed the position of the two sides on the scale. She didn't fall into the abyss, nor did she return to the human side. Instead, she wandered between the two sides. She looked completely different from the past, but her essence didn't change at all. This kind of appearance really made people feel helpless and unbearable from the bottom of their hearts. How funny, Xiaoxian. The old man shook his head and saw through the failure of this effort at a glance. This is your essence. It can't be changed, even if you are given love. He made a decisive judgment without any warmth. He was already well aware of the outcome of this farce. There were some things in this world that couldn't be changed with hard work alone, no matter how strong one's will or desire was. The physical world never relied on origin substances, and if you tried to use origin substances to interfere, you would have to be prepared for the situation to worsen. The more you want to get, the more the world will give you, but what you get may not be the result you want. In the end, other than emptiness and disillusionment, there was nothing left. That was how hell was created. Regardless of the literal meaning of hell, it was all the same. Did you find anything, Xiao Xian? I don't think so. Luo Xian tilted her head and thought for a while. Then she laughed self-deprecatingly. I seem to have lost a little more. I always feel that the losses outweigh the gains. After losing his original ferocity and predator nature, he was given a weak sense of compassion, but the hunger and inadequacy in his heart had never been satisfied. She was still incomplete. The old man nodded, not minding it at all. He just bent down and squeezed his overly sturdy body into the small sofa. He crossed his legs and asked, So, did you learn anything? If you want to say it, I don't think so. Luo Xian shook her head and sighed regretfully. I was given a sense of compassion, but the desire to kill something in my heart became even stronger. Is this what you meant by getting worse, father? After experiencing what love is, not only was I not satisfied, but I also yearned for that kind of thing even more. Happiness was obtained through death. Love was obtained through killing. No matter what, there was no way to make up for this natural flaw. The temporary satisfaction caused the monster side to temporarily retreat, but the desire for something that had once been obtained was thousands of times stronger than before. It would only become crazier. It's okay. Don't you still have father? Elder Luo slowly got up and reached out to her. Let's go home. No, father. Luo Xian thought for a while, shook her head, and said seriously, I already have someone I want to kill. HM, is that so? Yes. Luo Xian smiled. Until now, a trace of rosy appeared on her pale cheeks, and her dark eyes were filled with joy, expectation, and love. What kind of person is he? The old man scratched his head in confusion. Can you introduce him to father? Father, haven't you already met him? Luo Xian thought for a while and recalled the past memory. He's not like you. Father, who could be indifferent to what I did? He's also not like the other worldlings in the abyss who praised what I did. He's also not like the others who were afraid of my food and avoided me. After seeing my food, he actually wanted to taste it. Speaking of the scene at that time, she couldn't help but smile. Although he spat it out after just one bite and cried uncontrollably, he really didn't die. At that time, I suddenly thought, this is probably the arrangement of God, right? When I was at my loneliest, a person I wanted to kill was sent to me, and a person I couldn't kill became my friend, constantly reminding me of the ugliness and distortion. I don't know how to describe such feelings, but I want to kill him. Luo Xian looked at her father and told him seriously, or, it's the same if he kills me. In a long silence, the old man looked at his daughter and raised his eyebrows in astonishment. He didn't know if it was pity or pity, but he couldn't help but shake his head. The first love in more than 20 years is actually one-sided? What a pity, Xiao Xian. The old man sighed softly. Whether it's killing or being killed, loving or being loved, I'm afraid you won't get it. That's enough, isn't it? Luo Xian still looked at him and calmly accepted this reality. Didn't the book say that first love is always restrained and inexperienced? It's just that you can't get the result. It's not to the extent that it's depressing, right? The old man thought for a while and nodded. That's true. He asked, So, are you planning to leave home? Did you see through it? A father has to understand his daughter, right? The old man asked, Where do you plan to go? Rome? America? The Russian Federation? London? Or outside of the present world? I haven't thought about it yet. Luo Xian thought for a while and shook her head. I'll go out and walk around. Since I was born, I haven't been out of Jinling much. In this case, father will have a lot less worries, right? Will you come back? I'll naturally come and take a look when I pass by. Luo Xian said, Although it's a pity that I didn't kill you, I also hope that you can live a long life and not die in the hands of others. I'll try my best. The old man nodded indifferently. He looked at his daughter in front of him and felt that she was a little strange. It's really hard to understand. Did she grow up unknowingly? Or was it the magic of love that made people grow up? But in any case, it was time for her to face the world alone. It was like watching a fledgling who spread its wings to challenge the authority of the elders. Under the harsh and strict scrutiny, his eyes became gratified and helpless. The greedy, evil spirit actually yearns for restrained love. How ridiculous, Xiao Xian. Do you have such a dream? People always have dreams, right? Luo Xian replied hopefully, maybe one day, people like me can also be redeemed. Yes, maybe. The old man nodded and gently stroked the girl's long hair with his rough big hand, full of kindness. I hope you can enjoy this dream, Xiao Xian. If one day you find that you've woken up from your dream, come back. I'll be here waiting for you. He said, then, I'll kill you. He would kill the monster he created with his own hands and bring the final relief to his daughter who had completely despaired of the world. Okay, Luo Xian nodded, feeling the last tenderness of the old man. This was the final agreement between father and daughter. When Huaisher woke up in the same hospital, it was already a week later. He only remembered that he dragged his heavy injuries to Yu Dongri and drank a lot. After that, he fainted and fell to the ground. He woke up once in the middle and seemed to be on the operating table. In his dizziness, he heard the chief surgeon's disbelieving sigh. When he closed his eyes and opened them again, he was already lying on the hospital bed. He looked at the familiar ceiling and smacked his lips, feeling that something was wrong. After a deep sleep and recovery, those injuries had already healed, but Huaisher still couldn't get up. It was the aftereffects of using too much origin substance. Before the crack in his soul healed, he would probably have a nervous breakdown and insomnia for a long time. When he picked up his phone, he saw Yu Dongri's message. He saw that Huaisher didn't know when he would wake up. So he happily paid for a month's medical expenses and went to Shambhala alone for his so-called hot spring recuperation and hunting trip. Huaisher was extremely envious when she saw the photos of him with various young ladies in his circle of friends, as well as the huge humanoid robot that loomed in the background. If he had known earlier, he would have been more shameless and followed him. It would have been good to touch the robot. When he opened the internal app of the Astronomical Society, he saw a notice sent to him by the legal department. The secret trial of AI Qing had already started yesterday. Thanks to her excellent defense and AI Qing's own ability and value, or perhaps because of some political transaction and protection that Huaisher didn't understand, in the end, because she took the initiative to surrender, she was only sentenced to 20 years of border service, which was to be executed immediately. Unfortunately, the place she was in charge of was a confidential organization and unit. Huaisher didn't even know where she was going or how to contact her. When he called the original phone, he only received a voice notification that the phone was turned off. She seemed to have suddenly disappeared from the world that Huaisher could touch, like a phantom evaporating in the fog, leaving without a sound. Huaisher didn't feel anything at all. And another thing was that for some reason, due to the recognition of Huaisher's own talent and various reasons, he was promoted from a temporary action member to an official military officer in the Astronomical Society. Other than receiving partial legal immunity and the identity of an official member, under the recognition of the Dongsha genealogy, he replaced AI Qing's original position and became the new inspector of Xinhai. After 2 weeks, he would be able to receive the authority and information from the headquarters and become the representative of the Astronomical Society in Xinhai. Originally, the inspector needed to go through training and assessment at the border of London before being officially appointed. But for some reason, when it was Huaisher's turn, they were so perfunctory and careless, only sending an electronic notice and file verification. How'd it improve like this? What is going on? Huaisher sighed in confusion. After messing around, not only was he not removed from his position, he was even promoted. What were those people from the Central Management Department thinking? Shouldn't a young man like him, who had a mental problem, be trained more? In the end, Huaisher could only conclude there was something wrong with their heads. In any case, a salted fish like him was definitely not as responsible as AI Qing. Basically, he would touch if he could, drag if he could, push if he could, and play if he could. The Astronomical Society wasn't even afraid of him. So what was he worried about? He had full confidence in himself. He wasn't sure about other things, but he was too good at digging his own grave. Give me 2 months, and before the new year, I will be able to get rid of this position. By then, the sea will be wide, and the sky will be wide. Wouldn't that be perfect? Huaisher propped himself up and leaned against the headboard, finding a more comfortable position. Soon, he saw the small box between the fresh flowers on the bedside table. The packaging was familiar. He seemed to have seen it somewhere before. When he reached out and opened the box, he saw the bright crystal lying on the black velvet, a miracle condensed from faith and prayer, the light of divine grace. Below the crystal, there was a small note. Someone had left a message in beautiful handwriting. It seemed to be a farewell, but there was no name written on it. Huaishir was stunned. After a long, long time, he picked up the note in his hand and stared at the message. The sun will rise, as usual. He was amused. No matter what happened, the sun would rise as usual, illuminating everything old or new, and then set as usual, throwing the good and the bad into the darkness. Even if some things seemed to be an earth-shattering upheaval or an incredible miracle, no matter who was born or who disappeared, or who came or who left, it would not stop. This world would be the same without anyone, and it was the same for everyone. No one was indispensable, just like no one was impossible to exist. There was no parting that was unacceptable. Can't you just say goodbye? Huaishir shook his head and sighed helplessly. Where did she learn this hardcore way of saying goodbye? Or was she really so strong that she threw the possibility of reuniting to the back of her mind and wanted to say goodbye to him forever? Let her be. Anyway, a scourge like her would cause trouble even if she was thrown to the border. He would think about it when the time came. Well, even if she came crying to him and asked his good brother Huaishir to help her, even if she was willing to do anything in return, Huaishir would never be soft-hearted. 30 years on the surface of the river, 30 years at the bottom of the river. Don't bully the young for being poor. Thinking of the scene of Ai Qing admitting defeat and begging him, Huaishir could not help but laugh loudly. After a long, long time, in the slowly rising sleepiness, he fell into a deep sleep. Outside the window, the night passed little by little. After an unknown amount of time, the dim sky lit up again with the soft morning light. A new day was coming, as if the old day was about to end. The sun rose as usual. Chapter 3:13. Name: Huaishir. Age: 17. Gender: in the solemn and silent office, Huaishir slumped on the chair and couldn't help but sigh. Old Fu, what's the use of doing all these fancy things every time? Pa! The man behind the desk slammed the table angrily. Who are you calling Old Fu? Huaishir smiled and proudly retreated. We're on the same level now, so I won't call you Old Fu. Do you think it's appropriate for me to call you Uncle Fu? You even want to take advantage of the Astronomy Society. You're too much. You still know that you're the supervisor of the Astronomy Society. Old Fu was even angrier. He took out a thick stack of documents from the cabinet and slapped it in front of Huaishir. We've already sorted out this month's monthly report, weekly report, and the following quarterly report. I've urged you 100,000 times, but you haven't written a single word. Hurry up and do your work. I'm stuck, can't I? Huaishir retorted righteously. Besides, isn't the deadline not yet? Even if it's the end of the month, as long as you don't arrive before 12 o'clock, it's not considered a delay. After certain someone said that, he even put on an expression that said, why do we need to explain to others what the Astronomy Society does? This made Old Fu clench his teeth so hard that they almost broke. Ever since this little bastard became the supervisor, he was completely done for. He didn't do any proper work and started to slack off and be a salary thief. Forget about being a salary thief. He was paid by the Astronomy Society anyway. However, there were still a lot of action documents and scene maintenance work that required the supervisor's participation. This bastard had already slacked off from the Astronomy Society to the Social Security Bureau. This made Director Fu, who had never been one to let sand in his eyes, so angry that his teeth started to itch. He watched as the lively young man from back then became an old salted fish and a copper pea, but he couldn't do anything about it. Director Fu actually started to miss the time when Ai Qing was still around. Although he wasn't easy to deal with, he never had any problems with his daily work. Now, the weekly report was not handed in until the last minute. The monthly report was not written until the 31st of the month. As for the quarterly report, What was a quarterly report? In the beginning, this guy was perfunctorily writing a few standard documents on his computer. Later on, he simply took 30 pieces of white paper with the Astronomical Society seal and threw them to the Special Affairs Department at the end of the month. Not to mention the documents. Even the printer had to use the Special Affairs Department's ink cartridges. If it was just this, it would have been fine. After all, many idle inspectors would use the Astronomical Society's permission to make money. They wanted to take advantage of the local economy. But when they met such a Buddhist person like Huai Shi, according to the position of the Special Affairs Department, it was too late to cheer. But Director Fu couldn't stand it anymore. It's fine if you don't go to work, but you go to school every day with a cowherd face and hang around my daughter. It makes me feel uneasy. Can't you just do your job properly? Who said I don't work? Huai Shi's expression suddenly became serious. He slammed the table and asked in a loud voice, "Do you know what day it is today?" Director Fu froze for a moment and was immediately at a loss. What day? He picked up the desk calendar and flipped it over for a long time. He didn't see any to-do items or any special holiday symbols. He became more and more confused. Today is the day of the college entrance examinations pledge ceremony. Huai Shi picked up the teacup and took a sip slowly. He squinted at Director Fu and said helplessly, "I gave up such an important day to attend the pledge ceremony at school and came here to have a meeting with you. You're actually telling me this? Director Fu, do you really care about the future flower of the motherland?" Director Fu froze for a long time. His expression twitched, and the veins on his forehead popped like two children jumping rope. Every time the veins popped, for legs would stomp on his head, his cranial pressure soared. Flower? The motherland has 8 lifetimes of bad luck to have a flower like you in the future. He used the last of his rationality to convince himself that he couldn't kill this little b** starred in his own office. He could only pant and try his best to look away. Then, he saw Huai Shi's phone vibrate violently. After 3 crisp sounds of the alarm, a red message popped up on the interface of the Astronomy Society's internal application, causing Director Fu to freeze on the spot. An orange alert from the Astronomy Society? That was a large-scale disaster warning, second only to floods and hurricanes. Something big had happened. Huai Shi looked down and reached out his hand expressionlessly to press the alert. He turned back to drink his tea and comforted Director Fu. "Don't worry, it's nothing. It's happened so many times in the past 2 days. These people are always making a fuss over nothing. Why don't you take a look at what's up there?" Director Fu's eyes almost popped out of their sockets. Normally, if it was really related to Xian Hai, the Social Security Bureau's notice would have arrived a long time ago. Since he didn't receive it, it probably had nothing to do with Xian Hai or even the whole of Dongxia. But this was the first time he had seen a b** starred press the alert from the headquarters with an expression that said, "It's none of my business." And based on what he said, it wasn't just once. With an inspector like this, would he really be able to survive until retirement? Director Fu once again started to doubt this from the bottom of his heart. By the way, why am I here? Huai Shi scratched his head for a long time. Finally, he slammed the table and remembered. Proof of entry and exit. Director Fu expressionlessly took out a box from the drawer and placed it in front of Huai Shi. Then he pointed at the office door. "You can leave." "Okay, you're leaving." "Old Fu, you're getting more and more impolite. You don't even let people drink more than a cup of tea." Huai Shi put down the teacup, picked up the things, and prepared to leave. Suddenly, he remembered something and turned back to ask, "Oh right, I haven't seen Fu in a long time. Where did she go?" In the silence, Director Fu slowly picked up the phone in his hand and showed him the action team's phone number. "Believe it or not, as long as I call this number, you're dead meat." I believe it, okay?" Huai Shi curled his lips and sped up to leave. "Every time I come to this stupid place, I have to be interrogated. I don't even want to come." "All right," I stamped the seal on the A4 paper. "Send someone to my house in a few days to get it." After walking a distance, he turned back and pushed the door open. Before he finished speaking, he saw Director Fu pick up the thermos flask on the table and rush toward him. Director Fu hurriedly closed the door and ran away. This middle-aged man is already holding a thermos flask. Why is he still so hot-tempered? Isn't he afraid of a cerebral hemorrhage? Huaisher shook his head as he walked out of the door of the Special Affairs Department. After throwing the box in his backpack, he took out his keys and realized that he had forgotten where his car was parked. Then, he heard the guard yelling, "Who is this? This is the third time this month. Why can't you park your broken bicycle inside? Why do you have to tie it to the door? It's one thing to tie it up, but you have to F***king tie it up. Last time, you even left a hole in Director Fu's car. You don't want this month's salary." Sorry, I'll drive away now." Huaisher dejectedly picked up her bicycle, which was hanging on the iron gate, and ran away under the angry glare of the guard. Yeah, an old triangular steel frame bicycle. He just bought it at a discount. Not to mention, it was quite easy to ride and was very fast. The life of a rich person is really good. If I want to ride a bicycle, I'll ride a bicycle. If I want to take a bus, I'll take a bus. Huaisher enjoyed the envious looks of the people on the street. He whistled and pedaled his bicycle to the Chalcedony building. If it wasn't too eye-catching, he would have called Brother Mile to help him. That way, he wouldn't even have to pedal. After considering that if he said that, not only would the bicycle be destroyed, but his face would also have a few more horse hooves, he didn't dare to talk to White Horse. This horse was good at everything except for its bad temper and its appetite. Now, with Feng Shu taking care of it 3 times a day and eating all kinds of fruits, the horse was as fat as a balloon when it came back. Feng Shu's food was too good. It was like he was raising a pig. He had afternoon tea and supper 3 times a day, and he never stopped eating snacks. Now that it was mealtime, it didn't need Huaisher to call it. It would trot to the Chalcedony building to eat. Occasionally, when it was in a good mood, it would steal Huaisher's pancakes to eat. Now, there was a white horse and a crow at home. It was like a zoo. Wait, a crow? He suddenly had an ominous premonition. Immediately after, he felt his phone vibrate violently in his trouser pocket. It was as if a group of people were dancing in circles in his pocket. It vibrated nonstop. It was another alarm. The people from the Astronomy Society were always making a fuss about nothing. They would give an early warning about border disturbances, a slightly high wave in the endless ocean, and a warning about people entering the Discovery Realm. They just sent text messages all day long. They weren't afraid of disturbing the people. Huaisher calmly took out her phone. Just as she was about to see what the group of idiots had sent her, she almost flew off her bicycle. Your bank card ending with 4444 has spent 170,000 yuan today. Your bank card ending with 4444 has spent 670,000 yuan today. Your bank card ending with 4444 has spent... What the hell? A series of spending messages jumped out of the phone like a flood. When Huaisher saw it, it was still jumping. He was so scared that he almost fell into a ditch. My money! Huaisher's face turned green with fright. He pedaled the bicycle as if his but was on fire. The friction between the chain and the gears almost burst out with sparks. He instantly accelerated. The old-fashioned bicycle screeched and sped past an off-road vehicle, then a sports car. He didn't even leave behind the exhaust. He disappeared from the driver's sight as if he had seen a ghost. By the time Huaisher rushed up the mountain, it was already too late. What was done couldn't be undone. Huge trucks with yesterday's delivery logo were parked outside the Stone Marrow Hall. The bounty that Huaisher obtained from killing so many wanted criminals was already attached to the crow's little wings. It fluttered and flew into the distance. Hello, this is a 3-phase reactor from Hermes' workshop. Please sign here. Hello, this is a heavy-duty water-free chemical extraction platform. Water refinement precision source balancing device. This is the main unit of the ultra-fine optical engraving machine and 17 boxes of accessories. I am an engineer from the Border Power Grid Group. Thank you for the 10-year power supply service. Later, our construction team will connect you to the special equipment of the Border Power Supply. One delivery person after another surrounded Huaisher in the middle and said the words that would take the money away. Then, with a smile, they handed the sign form to Huaisher and waited for his signature. They also straightforwardly expressed that they would not return the money once it was in the account. After Huaisher signed all the bills, he wanted to cry but had no tears. His whole body had turned gray, and he almost couldn't breathe. Only the crow that landed on his shoulder raised its wings and patted his head. It comforted him with a voice that no one could hear. "Don't be sad. Sometimes you have to think positively," she said softly. "From another perspective, your money didn't leave you. Instead, it became the way I like to stay by your side. Thinking about it like this, don't you feel happy?" Huaisher felt despair. Chapter 314. A month ago, Huaisher went from Purple Silver Mountain to Chuzhou. Along the way, there were people with names and bounties on his head. A total of 17 heads. If it was any other time, the people who offered the bounties might have reneged, but when the representatives of the Astronomy Society came, all of them obediently gathered the bounty and sent him away like he was the plague. After several rounds of discussion with the Social Security Bureau, the Astronomy Society deducted the money used to repair the public facilities damaged during the battle. The total amount transferred to Huaisher's account was $200 million US. 200 million. That was 200 million US. If it was exchanged for East Summer Yuan, it would be 4 yuan. If he bought a monthly card, he could buy the World Destruction and become a shareholder of the Giant Goose. If he were to directly draw cards, on average, he would be able to break through 10,000 mobile phones and save a mobile phone factory that only knew how to cheat fans of their money aside from performing crosstalks. If he could use the time he spent on tapping on the screen to practice martial arts, he would be able to practice the two-finger vacuum grip that was so beautiful that it made Elder Luo cry. Then there was nothing. Everything was gone. Huaisher had worked so hard for so long, and it was rare for him to enjoy the warmth of the organization. In the end, before his heart could warm up, Crow woke up and poured a bucket of cold water on him. What saved him from his despair was a thick stack of printed manuscripts that were still warm in front of him. "What is this?" Huaisher raised his eyes and looked carefully for a long time before he saw a line of big words between the lines. "Spiritual Coffin Repair Encyclopedia." "Yes, I just wrote it. It's still warm." Crow proudly drank the lemon tea that Feng Shu brought over and sighed. "Now you know where the money is spent? Luckily, you met a master alchemist like Sister. Turning stone into gold is a piece of cake, not to mention repairing a small spiritual coffin. How is it? Are you surprised? Are you surprised?" "I'm surprised. I haven't seen where the joy is." Huaisher's expression twitched. He looked out the window and saw Feng Shu watering the flowers. He immediately lowered his voice and leaned over. "The spiritual coffin is repaired. But what about Feng Shu?" The stone marrow building itself was indeed a spiritual coffin, but it was a complete failure. After losing the power to awaken people, it instead gave birth to half a soul with self-consciousness. If the spiritual coffin was repaired, then what about Feng Shu? Where would Feng Shu go? Crow paused for a moment and revealed a meaningful smile. "That depends on you. What's your choice?" There was no need to say more. To choose an intact spiritual coffin or Feng Shu. That goes without saying. Huaisher slammed the table and raised her 5 fingers to form a claw in front of her chest. She replied in a trembling voice, "Of course I want all of them. Where did you learn to be so shameless? Aren't you the one who taught me all this?" Huaisher sat back in his chair and crossed his legs. This time, he was unhurried. "You must have been prepared. Tell me, what's the arrangement?" "The arrangement is actually very simple. I have a way. Not only can it repair the spiritual coffin in the stone marrow building, but it can also let Feng Shu use this spiritual coffin to truly have a complete soul. He won't be trapped in this building forever. But it depends on whether you're willing to help or not. Money is not a problem." Huaisher waved his hand and said straightforwardly. After that, he glanced at the seemingly innocent crow. "Besides, I don't have any money now." "Don't worry, I don't want your money." "Then give me back the 200 million. "You brat, don't always interrupt." Crow coughed awkwardly. After glaring at him, he continued to put on a serious face and pretended nothing happened. "Where were we? Money?" Crow looked at him for a long time with a "the whole family is disappointed in you" look. It was only when Huaisher looked away that he slowly said, "Help." "Yes, you're right. Help out. Continue." Huaisher picked up her teacup and sipped her tea as if nothing had happened. She wanted to see what kind of fart this black-hearted bird could come up with. The spiritual coffin's repair can actually be started now, but it has nothing to do with you. The materials and tools are all here, so I can finish it myself. But once the spiritual coffin is repaired, the process can't be reversed. It must be finished within half a year. Otherwise, not only will the spiritual coffin be destroyed, but Feng Shui will also be seriously injured. Crow said, and the opportunity for Feng Shui to be independent of the spiritual coffin lies with you. Me? Huaishir pointed at himself, feeling that she was up to something again. Don't worry, I'm not tricking you this time. Crow looked at Huaishir's face and sighed helplessly. He felt the shock of losing his credit. How do you think the silly kids nowadays learn so quickly? He originally said that he could cheat for 2 more years, but he only took advantage of it for a few months? Tell me, what do you want me to do? Advance. Crow said, not the low-level, pauper version of the advance, but the advance tailor-made for you from the beginning as the master of the spectrum. Do you understand? Follow the list I gave you and complete your advancement precisely. Not one less, not one less. You must finish it within half a year. After half a year, when the spiritual coffin is completely repaired, you will advance inside the spiritual coffin. At that time, when a young master's life's divinity descends, you will be able to use the origin substance during the advance to create a miracle. You, Feng Shui, and the stone essence hall will be able to simultaneously advance. At that time, you will become the young master's life. Feng Shui will obtain a soul, and the stone essence hall will be able to use this opportunity to become a borderline spiritual land. Borderline spiritual land? What do you mean? Huaishir was dumbfounded. You want to tear down my house? Seeing that Huaishir had rolled up his sleeves and was about to go all out, Crow didn't beat around the bush. He hurriedly said, it's just putting 2 wheels under the stone essence hall. In the future, you can buy a piece of land at the border and we can directly move your house there. Wouldn't that make it easier for you to run away? Huaishir's eyes widened. I haven't done anything outrageous. Why do I have to run away? Crow rolled his eyes. Then tell me if you want it or not. Yes, why wouldn't I want it? Huaishir nodded so quickly that it was almost as if he wasn't the one who had angrily rebuked Crow. After waiting for a long time, he finally reacted. Wait a minute. Are you saying that I have to advance in half a year? That's way too fast. The basic ingredients for the rookie competition had been prepared, but Huaishir's progress was still quite far away. Today, he had received the entry pass that he had applied for a long time from Director Fu, which allowed him to enter the Eastern Summer Country's border plantation, Mtdiu. Apart from the largest medicinal plantation in the Eastern Summer Country, there were also 3 Abyss Botanical Research Centers and 2 Lone Herb Conservation Centers. Apparently, the security there was so tight that even the Eastern Summer Country's own people had to go through a political review before they could enter. However, Huaishir had only waited for a month before successfully obtaining the entry pass. According to his cousin, Mtdiu was filled with earth chi anyways. After entering, feel free to touch as much as you want. What the mountain ghost Sacred Mark pursued was the existence of life force, not the quantity. What he touched was not even worth the loss of a leaf. As long as Huaishir didn't accidentally pull out any lone herb by its roots, he would be able to take care of it for him. He would just treat it as a token of gratitude from Huaishir for giving him so many third-class merits. However, the location of the entrance was rather remote. It wasn't connected to the outside world, nor was there a special teleportation ceremony. He could only make an appointment in advance and wait for someone to pick him up. After going there once, Huaishir estimated that he would most likely be able to reach the 3rd origin substance transformation. Even so, he was still lacking the remaining ingredients. He had obtained the divine light of grace, but the blood-hatred crystal and the ashes of evil creatures were both incredibly expensive and difficult to find. Furthermore, he was still missing half of the 4 main ingredients. He had already experienced the true meaning of the soul link and the void, but he still hadn't even seen the shadow of yesterday and the birth of life. Who said there's no shadow? Crow looked at him with disappointment. The opportunity has already presented itself to you, but you don't even know how to grasp it. Are you still the smart and quick-witted little Peppa from the past? Huaishi's expression immediately twitched. Don't mention that nickname. We're still good friends. Following Huaishi's exploding popularity, this nickname had also been dug up by a group of idiots on the dark net who didn't mind causing a scene. Furthermore, the situation had become more and more intense. There were even copyright owners who came to collect royalties. Royalties? What a joke. It had always been the theme park collecting royalties from other people. Who would dare to come to the theme park and ask for royalties? Huaishi naturally pretended that nothing had happened. However, before the first wave had subsided, another wave had arisen. After the popularity of the nickname Little Peppa of the Huaisi Road had subsided, a new nickname began to circulate on the darknet. Jean Ling's Decapitation King. Jean Ling's Decapitation King? Because Huaishi wanted to save time, he was too quick to collect heads with his axe. As a result, not a single body was left intact. Many famous experts had been decapitated. Decapitation. Some had their entire heads chopped off by Huaishi. They couldn't even collect their bounties. God knew how much money they had lost. The only thing they had gained was that after everyone heard that Jean Ling's Decapitation King had come to Xianhai to be the inspector, the entire border market of Xianhai had suddenly become quiet. Even the smuggling that used to be prohibited had disappeared. But if he thought about it carefully, if no one broke the law, didn't that mean he couldn't even collect the fines? After he became the inspector, it had been more than a month, and he still hadn't received any fines. Forget about those who looked down on him because of his youth. He hadn't even issued a single fine. This made Huaishi's mood even worse. By the way, don't you think you've been too lazy recently? Crow tilted his head and studied him for a long time. Ever since you came back, you haven't gone to school. Every day, you stay at home to play games. You're so young. It's one thing for you to not have a job, but you don't even have a girlfriend? Even though Huaishi wanted to say that having a girlfriend was not as fun as playing games, he felt like he couldn't answer that question. He could only change the topic and ask, "Didn't you say earlier that the opportunity had come? Where is it? Why don't you show it to me?" Crow sighed. He raised his wings and curled them around his phone. He showed him the alert from the astronomy club that popped up on the screen. "I beg you, at least look at the news." Chapter 315. As Crow raised the phone, Huaishi hurriedly leaned over to take a closer look and immediately widened his eyes in disbelief. American Taurus is having a difficult birth? Now the entire realm is urgently recruiting auxiliary personnel. He was stunned for a long time and did not react at all. Is this asking me to deliver the baby? Crow looked at him as if he was an idiot for a long time and couldn't help but cover his face and sigh. "I'm asking you to do the one below." Huaishi's expression twitched. He looked down and then frowned. The witch's night is coming? What the hell is this? The late funeral of a creator. Crow said indifferently, 41 years ago, a creator died in the abyss. After the laws and theorems she created in her life were freed from her soul, they began to slowly float up. After 40 years, they finally reached the present realm. Now the Astronomy Society has urgently adjusted the position of all the borders to welcome her final return. In a few days, a big storm will roll up outside the seal of the present realm. The scholars who have been waiting for a long time at the observatory will select the rules she set and then integrate them into Zarathustra, merging with the entire present realm and finally converging into the Silver Sea. This is the final fate of every creator. Their lifetime of talent and achievements will lay the cornerstone of the present realm, making the world more and more perfect. And in this process, the dream of bubbles will randomly appear all over the world, forming a phenomenon called the Witch's Night. It will be an illusory dream formed by the obsession of the creator's life, a hell that only exists for one night, and also a final carnival. At that time, the goal that the creator had pursued all his life would be realized in this short dream. Countless scholars and ascendants from all over the world were rubbing their fists and rubbing their palms, eager to give it a try, hoping to gain something from this dream. Let me say in advance that the laws and results mastered by this creator are still kept secret by the Astronomy Society, and the relevant situation is unknown. The danger after entering is extremely high, and if you fail, your soul may be damaged. But if you can successfully explore the Witch's Night, then you can receive the Creator's final blessing as the Anointed One. For you, if you want to speed up your advancement, this is the best opportunity. It was the first time Crow spoke so seriously about the consequences of messing up, and Huaisher suddenly felt a little pressured. Before this, didn't Sister Crow always have a look of "don't worry, go ahead, I'll protect you"? Huaisher swallowed her saliva and thought for a moment before asking, Are there any successful examples? Yes. Crow thought for a moment and said, 12 years ago, the Night of the Witch was a phenomenon after the fall of a metal creator. At that time, during the exploration, the blessed anointed obtained an iron hen that could lay golden eggs. On average, 1 egg per day could hatch a golden chick, pure 24K. Huaisher's eyes lit up. The Witch's Night 27 years ago was caused by a creator who specialized in thermodynamics. The Anointed One obtained an electric blanket that never needed to be plugged in. Seeing Huaisher curl his lips, Crow added, later, it was auctioned at the Magic Gold Bank for a high price of $93 billion. Now, it is a collection in the Astronomy Society's exhibition hall. Huaisher's eyes lit up again, filled with longing and hope for life. Also, 30 years ago, it was a double creator of classical mechanics and geology who gave the Anointed One a blessing. It was a brand new semi-frontier, a huge underground base that could be opened at any time. Huaisher was excited. 41 years ago, a creator of mechanical dynamics left behind a blessing. It was a super large combat robot that could be charged for 8 hours and battle for 10 minutes. Its destructive power was amazing. Amazing? Huaisher's eyes were filled with stars. It can also transform. Crow added, it has a fusion function. Huaisher was moved to tears. What kind of god creator was this? He wanted to go to the Astronomy Society to find 2 portraits of that god and burn a few sticks of incense every day. He was fascinated by the prospects described by Crow and began to rub his hands together, eager to give it a try. Young man, you are still too young. Crow sighed and silently looked elsewhere. He hid the last sentence in his stomach. Well, except for the Anointed One mentioned above, most of the other participants are already dead, so if you lie to honest people too much, you will feel bad. But why do you want to do it a few more times? Can't stop. In fact, other than the super large machine, what shocked Huaisher the most was something he had never noticed before. The creator can also die? He sighed softly. Even someone as noble as the creator, a creator who could change reality, borders, and even hell according to the laws he grasped, an existence who could change everything like a god as long as he had enough origin substance, had no choice but to face death in the end. Yes, we will die. Everyone will die. The crow sighed softly, including the gods and great spirits of the past. In the face of death, everyone is equal, even if they are not human. She paused for a moment and suddenly said, I'm going to die soon. Huaisher was stunned for a long time. He suddenly raised his head and widened his eyes. What did you say? Didn't you hear me? I'm going to die. Crow said casually, the signs have been getting clearer and clearer recently. When I woke up last night, I already knew the specific time. Looking at Huaisher's nervous expression, she sighed sadly. Well, it will probably be in 200 years. Death is really scary. Huaisher, you have to take care of me, okay? Before I die, can you take out your money and contribute it? Huaisher's expression twitched. He tried to control his impulse to pick her up and throw her out. He looked away and said, pretend I didn't ask. Sure enough, there must be something wrong with him if he had any expectations for this kind of woman. He confirmed this point again and didn't want to talk about this topic anymore. He just asked, what do I have to do next? Entering the Witch's Night is very troublesome, right? Well, it is indeed very troublesome. Crow nodded and guided him step by step. First of all, turn on your mobile phone and register in the volunteer list. Then, click Volunteer to explore the Night of the Witch at your own risk and enter your mobile phone number here. Lastly, take a selfie with your identification card to show that you are willing to do this and that no one is forcing you to do it. Well, that's it. After going through a set of procedures like getting an ID card, Crow flapped her little wings and nodded. She said, "The next step is to wait for approval from the higher-ups. In this period of time, you can do what you have to do." Huaisher nodded and got up to walk to the living room. He was stopped by Crow again. Crow stared at him for a long time as if she expected better from him and said, "I don't mean to continue to play games at home." "Then what should I do?" Huaisher was confused. "I just bought the game and haven't opened it yet." Crow shook her head. "How long have you not gone out?" "Why haven't I gone out?" Huaisher asked. "Didn't I just—" Crow looked at him quietly. After he finished speaking, she sighed and said, "You should know what I mean, Huaisher. Do you think going to the Social Security Bureau to get your ID and then squatting at home to play games is going out? Can't you go out and play for a while? I have games, Coke, and air conditioning at home. Why should I go out?" Huaisher looked reluctant. "Don't become a homebody, okay?" Crow looked at the youth in front of her who had completely turned into a salted fish and began to have a headache. "Even if you don't go to school, can you not always stay at home? Adults need to learn to take care of themselves." Huaisher, even if you don't have a girl to play with, don't be like a pitiful child who has no friends, okay? Huaisher turned around in a circle. Finally, he tilted his head and turned the black question mark on his head to face her. He had no idea what she was talking about. "Anyway, go out for a walk." Crow lost her patience and flapped her wings to chase him out of the chalcedony shop. "Even if you can't find any fun, it's better than rotting at home. Don't come back before dinner." Bang. The iron door closed behind Huaisher. Huaisher turned around and looked at Feng Shu, who was happily waving goodbye to him in the courtyard. He sighed helplessly and reluctantly said, "Okay, but where to go next?" He couldn't find anywhere to go. Ever since the cello was taken away by the Hell Music Association for repair, he couldn't even practice. He could only stay at home and rot every day. In fact, he originally wanted to go to school to pass the time and then see his stupid classmates. In the end, the astronomy club chose to transfer money when Huaisher was in class. There were more than 30 transfers, each with an average amount of $8 million. As the transfer messages rang out, the phone vibrated violently under the astonished gazes of the teachers and students. A melodious voice played. "A total of $200 million has been transferred to your account. Hurry and send a message to him." Send a message? What message? Huaisher wanted to burn his whole family down. Fortunately, other than Fu Yi, no one took this seriously. They just thought it was Huaisher's prank, which caused Huaisher's favorability with the teachers to plummet. "No, this kid is too arrogant. I need to teach him a lesson. He left a lot of homework for him. He couldn't handle it anymore." In the end, Fu Yi also went on a trip without a word. Huaisher didn't even have a friend to talk to in school. It was like a lonely legend in Xinhai. Speaking of the various sad stories that happened in the past month, Huaisher couldn't help but write 108 miserable characters on his legs. How did he become a prince of paradise, riding a white horse and singing songs, suddenly become an old salted fish? Chapter 3:16. Once a person became lazy, they would feel that time was extremely difficult to pass. Huaisher walked down the mountain lazily. He did not want to take a taxi. He wandered like a stray dog until he entered the city and looked at the scene of people coming and going. He felt out of place. He felt that he must have contracted some kind of PTSD. It was the kind of illness that caused one to be unable to sleep at night without holding a gun after going to the battlefield. If he didn't play games for 8 hours or fish for 8 hours every day, he would feel extremely uncomfortable. He could not muster up the energy. It had been a few days. He had not shaved his beard, his hair was unkempt, and he was wearing a pair of slippers. He did not look like a decent person. Feeling the pity of the people around him, Huaisher scratched his head and did not know how to explain. He wandered around aimlessly. When he passed by the arcade, he bought a cup of milk tea. He sat on the chair and watched others dance for half an hour. He drew 2 balls and took out his mobile phone to open the Zhongyan app. He looked at the update of monsters die when killed. He looked at other people's golden fingers. They were cool, impressive, and even gave away treasures. He then looked at his own stinky woman who was thinking about how to spend his money every day. Why was there such a huge difference between people? After lamenting, he sat in the mall and began to draw cards. After drawing all the stones that he had accumulated over the past few days, he took out his mobile phone and began to browse Weibo and WeChat moments. After he left 2 comments under Wangba Shampoo's official Weibo, he was done with his happy Weibo. There was nothing to do. Boring. Huaishir sighed and leaned on the chair. He looked around, hoping that there would be some mercenaries, gangsters, bad guys, and alike who would suddenly jump out to rob the mall or carry out a terrorist attack. He could then rush up and chop these blind people to death. In the end, after waiting for a long time, not a single monster appeared. He almost scared away the staff member who was wearing a doll and was jumping over to distribute flyers. Life was really too difficult. She had no job, no friends, and no money. Only time was so hard to pass. No matter how she tried, she just couldn't move fast. It was not until he walked up and down the entire Renaissance shopping mall several times that he went to the auction house that he had once robbed that he did not find any opportunity to issue a ticket under the frightened and cautious gaze of the person in charge that he could not find any opportunity to issue a ticket. He could only sigh unhappily and turn around to leave. Sounds of relief could be heard from behind. It was as if a heavy burden had been lifted from his shoulders. Who wouldn't be afraid if the guillotine king of Jinling suddenly came for an inspection? Finally, it was time to go home for dinner. However, when Huaishir saw the long string of payment messages on his phone, he couldn't help but feel his liver ache. No, the family must have some income today. Huaishir found a bathroom and straightened his hair. He washed his face and tried his best to put on a serious look. He nodded and found a red armband stuffed in his pocket. He casually put it on his arm. I have to go back to my old business. Standing on the 5th floor of the mall, Huaishir looked around at the various restaurants that were bustling with people. He nodded and walked straight in the direction of the fire safety door. It was time to teach this group of people who did not abide by public order a good lesson. He kicked open the fire safety door and rushed into the corridor behind the door. Sure enough, he saw a floor full of cigarette butts and several people squatting on the ground smoking. When they saw a person with a red armband come in, they suddenly panicked. "Don't move, check," Huaishir shouted, rolled up his sleeves, and pointed to the wall. "No smoking, a fine of 200 yuan, do you see?" In the brief silence, those people raised their heads and looked at the bare wall. They wanted to say something, but stopped and wanted to say something again. Because there were no slogans on the wall. "Oh, it's not on this floor." Huaishir glanced at it and reacted. His expression became serious again. "Smoking is prohibited in public areas. Why don't you have any sense of civility? Don't run. The surveillance cameras are watching. Be careful of the announcement. It's like looking for a child. How embarrassing, right? Come, stand still, 200 yuan per person. Don't smoke. Still smoking, it's not good for your lungs. Quit." Huaishir took the cigarette out of the mouth of a dumbfounded man and casually threw it down the stairs. From a distance, he heard a furious F***CK and didn't know which unlucky guy he hit. He didn't know whether it was because of the momentum of the red armband or because Huaishir's actions were too familiar. After he collected 4 or 5 money, there were still people who didn't react. Until he heard a chuckle behind him. "Why are you so bored again?" Huaishir was stunned. He turned around and saw Fu Yi, who he hadn't seen for a long time. After disappearing for half a month, she finally came back. She didn't seem to have changed. She seemed to have just finished eating and was ready to come here to freeload. "Why are you here?" "I just came back from the high seas with my mom. After chasing the ocean currents for half a month, I'm sick of eating fish. I came back to eat some meat to nourish myself. Didn't you receive my message?" Huaishir shook his head. "You didn't receive it. My phone was in arrears the next day. I didn't have time to pay it when I came back." Fu Yi shook her head and threw away the unlit cigarette. She patted him on the shoulder. "Let's go. I'll treat you to a meal." "That's good." Who wouldn't be happy when there was free food to eat? Huaisha rubbed his hands excitedly and hurried to catch up. Before leaving, he deliberately turned back and pointed at the few people who hadn't paid the fine and sternly said, "I'll remember you. I'll go do something first. Later, you go to the front desk and pay the fine yourselves." Before they could react, he closed the fire door, ran away. In the silence, only a few people with confused faces and the angry old man who rushed up from downstairs looked at each other in astonishment. What happened? Why did my money disappear? It can only be said that Fu Yi was really a good brother. In the private room of the best barbecue restaurant in Shanghai, the meat was roasting over the fire. Even 2 sets of cutlery were prepared. After idling for so long, meeting Fu Yi again made Huaisha so touched that tears almost fell. As expected, you're still the best brother. He picked up his chopsticks, picked up 2 pieces of meat, dipped them in sauce, and stuffed them into his mouth. He felt his whole body calm down, and he felt hot tears in his eyes. "Old friend, why didn't you come back earlier? My life was so hard." For some reason, Fu Yi sat opposite him, looking at him strangely, like she wanted to say something but stopped. "What's wrong?" Huaisha was confused. "Is there something dirty on my face?" "No, I'm just thinking about how to tell you." Fu Yi hesitated for a long time. She raised her hand and pointed at the bowl and chopsticks in front of him. "You're using my mom's cutlery." Huaisha froze on the spot. In the silence, footsteps came from outside the private room. They slowly approached, and a lady who was dressed very brightly walked in. She lowered her head and said to the phone, "Okay, I've received the things, so I won't go. You can arrange for someone else. I'm going to eat with my daughter." After hanging up the phone, she raised her head and saw the man sitting in her seat, holding her own chopsticks and eating barbecued meat with her daughter. She froze on the spot. Only Fu Yi looked at the 2 of them calmly and introduced them to each other. "Mom, this is my classmate Huaisha. Huaisha, this is my mom." Huaisha was stunned for a long time, and he tried to swallow the meat in his mouth. He looked at the chopsticks, not knowing whether to put them down or hold them. It was not until Fu Yi kicked him under the table that he hurriedly got up and bowed. "Hello, Auntie. I'm Huaisha. Yes, the Prince of Paradise, the beheading king of Jinling. I've heard of you a long time ago." After the initial shock, Fu Yi's mother had already reacted. She glanced at Huaisha, who had a black face full of question marks, asked the waiter to bring another set of cutlery, and sat down opposite them. She was quite calm. "The meat is already cooked. Hurry up and eat. It won't taste good if it's burnt." She pointed at the barbecued meat and took the lead in picking up her chopsticks. Huaisha froze on the spot. He felt that it was not the right time to eat, but it was also not the right time. He was only afraid that the Annie would suddenly throw her cup as a signal, and a dozen people would rush in from outside and chop him up, although he might not necessarily be hurt. Wouldn't it be too disrespectful if he resisted? Just as his imagination was running wild, Fu Yi glanced at him and shook her head. "Don't worry and eat. My mom and dad are different. Even if they were different, he couldn't eat at ease." Huaisha gave Fu Yi a fierce look and asked her with his eyes, "Why didn't you tell me that your mom was here?" Fu Yi gave him a look and told him, "My mom said that she wanted to see you, and we just happened to bump into each other." Then, neither of them understood what the other was saying. They could only struggle to get through the more difficult time in a frenzy of glances. He felt like he was sitting on pins and needles. His heart was filled with grief and indignation. "I treated you as a brother, but you actually wanted to harm me. Speaking of which, we should be considered colleagues. However, I work in a department under the Marine Committee of the Continuation Institute, and I don't often interact with people from the Central Command Bureau." Fu Yi's mother raised her eyes and glanced at Huaisha. "To be honest, I think it's not suitable to be a supervisor at such a young age. It's better to study." Oh. Huaisha could only nod. Whatever the Annie said, he didn't dare to refute. Mei Li, a Roman Chinese, Fu Yi's mother, Director Fu's ex-wife. At the same time, she was also an internationally renowned scholar who specialized in the changes and adjustments of ocean currents. She was much better than Director Fu. With such an ex-wife, he must be under a lot of pressure, right? Well, No wonder he was getting angrier and angrier recently. It would probably be difficult to fight for custody. It could be seen that Ms. Lee was quite a scholar. This sentence meant that it was easy to offend people if you spoke without beating around the bush. Perhaps she knew, but she didn't care. Plus, with the aura of an elder here, Huaishir could only play dumb. He nodded crazily and smiled stiffly, like a dumb goose that came out of nowhere. She seemed to be quite dissatisfied with Director Fu's plan for Fu Yi. She didn't want her daughter to waste her time in such an ordinary school. If she had time in Rome, it would be better for her daughter to be her assistant, which would be more helpful for the future. Anyway, Fu Yi didn't care where she went. This time, she followed her mother to the sea to chase ocean currents for half a month, helping to sample, observe, collect, and record data. It looked like she was tanned by the ultraviolet rays at sea. Then he stared at Huaishir's pale skin, which had not been exposed to the sun for a long time, with jealousy in his eyes. If Huaishir was a woman, she would definitely think that this little b** TCH took advantage of her absence to do maintenance behind her back. Chapter 3:17. Huaishir was creeped out by Professor Lee's scrutinizing gaze from time to time. Naturally, he didn't notice the strange look his good friend was giving him. In fact, he didn't even taste the food at all. His heart was in a mess, and he didn't know what this Annie was thinking. Don't worry, I'm different from that old-fashioned old Fu. I don't think that holding hands with children is the same as going to bed. After the meal, Professor Lee elegantly wiped her mouth and said, "Besides, you're not young anymore. If you really want to hold hands until you go to bed, no one can stop you. When young Americans were your age, they were already sleeping around. What can parents do? It's already a blessing to have protective measures in place." Huaishir was stunned. He subconsciously raised his hand and wanted to say that he didn't. God had mercy on him. He never had any improper thoughts about his good friend. At best, they were just members of the ward club. Occasionally, they would freeload off each other and be each other's negative energy trash cans. It was already a luxury to find someone to listen to him. How would he dare to lust after her body? He didn't even dare to think about it. It was simply too despicable. He stuttered for a long time and could only sigh. As expected of a Roman, Professor Lee's mind was really too open. Fu Yi is my daughter. She has been a person with her own ideas since she was a child. She has more ideas than I did when I was young. I don't need to worry about her. Professor Lee's eyes were like torches. She saw through Huaishir's little plan at a glance. Besides, don't you already have several rumored girlfriends? I'm not. Huaishir didn't have the energy to defend herself. She hadn't even done anything, but her reputation was already in tatters. Was the rumor that he was a central air conditioner and a scumbag so popular? He swallowed a mouthful of blood. He was afraid of Fu Yi's mother. She was more than 10 levels higher than old Fu. Okay, let's stop joking around. Professor Lee waved her hand. She made it sound like she was really joking. She glanced at her daughter, who was still as calm as ever, and nodded in praise. You've made a good friend. Well, it's just that you're a little shy. Don't listen to his nonsense. Fu Yi shrugged. He told me a few days ago that there is no pure friendship between men and women. Professor Lee adjusted his glasses and sneered. You make it sound like there's something between men. The old scholar was truly terrifying when he started racing. Huaishir sucked in a cold breath and forced himself to swallow a mouthful of blood, shrinking his neck like a little quail. How could he have the courage to jump out and fight with this nascent divinity expert? How terrifying! Unlike old Fu, who was paranoid about his daughter being persecuted, she didn't seem to care about what was going on between Huaishir and Fu. It was unknown if she was really open-minded, or if she had confidence in her daughter, or, after meeting her once, she knew that even if Huaishir had the intention to do something, he wouldn't have the guts to do it. After dinner, she answered a phone call and left in a hurry. Huaishir was left paralyzed in the chair, sweating profusely. He felt his heart failure and didn't want to move at all. What's going on today? He looked at Fu Yi. What's the old woman doing? Didn't she ask someone to investigate you? This time, you seem to have participated in some rookie competition and seem to be very famous. She said she wanted to meet you. Fu Fu Yi patted him on the shoulder. Actually, she asked you to come here. First, it's a coincidence. Second, she asked you to help her. Anyway, thank you for your hard work. As soon as he heard this kind of traditional drama, Huaishi's eyes lit up. Is your mother going to introduce you to someone from a prestigious family? Do you need me to provide a bridal kidnapping service? I'm very sneaky. What are you thinking about? Fu Yi looked at him strangely for a long time. She just wants to take me to Rome. I don't really want to go. She doesn't want me to stay in Dongsha. She wants me to work as a scholar with her. Even if I can't be a scholar, she can introduce me to a more leisurely job at the astronomy club. To be honest, this idea is quite reliable. Huaishi nodded in agreement. An official scholar was much harder to cultivate than an ascender. The latter depended on luck, and most of them were tools and footmen of big trust companies. The former depended on talent. Without talent, one might not achieve anything in their lifetime. With talent, 2 or 3 years of hard work could be compared to a lifetime of hard work. Knowledge was power. The field of top students was so unreasonable. As a scholar of ocean currents, and one who was qualified to participate in the annual Ocean Current Maintenance and Adjustment Conference, his status was naturally not low. It was easy to arrange a more leisurely position for his daughter. Even at the astronomy club, there was a lot of work that needed to be done by ordinary people. No, it should be said that the proportion of ordinary people in the astronomy club was much higher than that of the ascenders. Just the direct and indirect peripheral employees alone exceeded 1 million, and there were more than 100,000 officially registered employees. There was no lack of ordinary people in high positions. Whether they were ascended or not was not a problem. In any case, whether it was the general administration, the continuation court, the technical department, or other places, there was a tailor-made ascension plan for the higher-ups. They could be promoted however they wanted and whenever they wanted. A sublimator who only knew how to fight and kill could only be a military officer at best. In the end, there would only be a double red stick. A qualified organization would always be controlled by the brain and the hands. When had it ever been the turn of the thugs to be the masters? Inside jobs like AI Ching were the real backbone. If Fu Yi could find a job in the astronomy club, it would naturally be a good thing. But on the other hand, Director Fu would certainly not want his daughter to travel the sea alone. It's not easy for you to have such parents. He shook his head in pity. Yeah, Fu Yi chuckled softly. Since I was young, my mother has been busy with work. I don't see her for a long time. Maybe she feels that she owes me, so she always gives me a lot of money every time, as if giving me money will make me happy. My dad is the same. He has a bad temper. He always drinks and gets angry. After he gets angry, he feels sorry for me and buys a lot of things to apologize to me. I understand. After a short silence, Huaisher comforted her softly. Don't be sad. Actually, it's quite cool. Fu Yi, who was immersed in her memories, sighed softly. I was the richest woman in class since I was young. I was the first to play with first-tier clothes and toys. Everyone else was envious. Well, by the way, what did you say just now? No, I didn't say anything. Huaisher sat a little to the side and coldly distanced himself. You're no longer my good brother. You're paying the bill today, he said coldly. Fu Yi glanced at him. She was already used to his occasional spasms. After leaving the mall, Fu Yi threw her and her mother's huge luggage to Huaisher. She walked in front of him and stretched lazily. She suggested, You've been suffering at sea for half a month. It's not easy to come back. Do you want to go for an all-nighter? I have to go out at night. Huaisher scratched his nose awkwardly. Change it to Tiansheng? Okay. By the way, your mother just left in such a hurry. Where did she go? My dad should be looking for her, right? Fu Yi shook her head. They must be quarreling again. I'm too lazy to get involved. Let them be. That's not necessary. Huaisher shook his head. They're divorced. Why bother? Huh? Didn't I tell you? The girl walking in front looked back at Huaisher and told him calmly, My mom is going to remarry. Huaisher stopped in his tracks and froze on the spot. She's pregnant. It's a boy. Fu Yi smiled. She hasn't told me yet. Huaisher was silent for a long time and said softly, I'm sorry. You didn't do anything wrong. Why are you sorry? Fu Yi turned back and looked at him strangely. You're becoming more and more like a scumbag who apologizes at every turn. Huai sure didn't say anything else. He followed her silently and sent her to the entrance of the hotel. He put down the huge luggage and said, "Can you drag it back from here? Ah, at least it's a star. I'll call the waiter." Fu Yi waved goodbye. "Sorry to trouble you to carry the luggage today." "That's easy." Huai sure sighed, wanting to say something but hesitated. There was nothing much to say. Fu Yi, on the other hand, was more open-minded than him, as if she had already expected the current situation. "It's going to rain. Mom is going to get married. And it's not your mom. Why are you sad?" She was amused by Huai Shi's expression. "You looked so serious just now. It was as if you were going to visit a grave." "I just don't know what to say." Huai Shi shrugged. "You know, I don't have any relevant experience." "Ahem, look on the bright side. They're still alive, right?" Fu Yi was stunned for a long time and looked at him strangely. After a long time, her shoulders trembled and she couldn't help but burst out laughing. "You're really good at comforting people, Huai Shi." "Ha ha, ha ha, ha ha." Before Huai Shi could react, he saw her suddenly take a step forward, reach out, and gently hug him. The warm feeling was fleeting. She let go of her hand as if she had been electrocuted and took a step back. She was still smiling as if nothing had happened. Huai Shi stood there in a daze. He didn't react. "Thanks, bro." She waved goodbye and turned to drag the huge bag into the hotel. She disappeared into the lights behind the revolving door. When the elevator finally closed, she seemed to look back at Huai Shi. Then the elevator closed. Huai Shi stood there for a long time until the phone in his pocket vibrated. It was the landline of the Stone Marrow Museum. "I'll be back." He looked back at the brightly lit hotel behind him and turned to leave. Behind him, a curtain was slowly drawn shut. The long night came. Chapter 3:18. "Wow, young man, you look so serious as if you've just come back from a funeral." Crow studied Huai Shi's face in astonishment. "Did your confession get rejected in just one afternoon?" "If only my confession was rejected." Huai Shi rubbed his face, pushed open the door, and walked down the stairs into the enclosed basement. "When do I leave?" "Starting at 12 in the morning. You have 2 hours to take a shower, cut your nails, brush your teeth, and then come back to this bed and lie down." Crow landed on the table, stepping on a letter. As for the tickets, they were delivered at 6 o'clock. Inside the envelope was an elegant card. Huai Shi's name was written on it, and it seemed to be an invitation to some banquet. "That's it?" Huai Shi looked at it curiously. "Ah, as I expected, it's the most common thing. The people at the command bureau are really stingy." Crow snorted in disdain. "Other than entering and exiting the witch's night, it has no other functions. Life and death are up to fate. At most, it can guarantee that you won't die. Heh, I'm afraid the important slots are reserved for internal researchers. Is there anything better than this? Of course, how can a normal account be the same as a pay-to-win account?" Crow snorted a few times, raised its wings, and pulled the invitation from Huai Shi's hand. "Anyway, there's still some time. Let me see if there are any bugs or loopholes that I can exploit. Who said that I can't be a seal? Hey, don't mess around." Huai Shi was so scared that he broke out in a cold sweat. "What if I get hacked by some antivirus program?" Don't worry. I'm a professional when it comes to cheating. Back when I was messing around, those guys in the technical department couldn't even eat my tail. Ah, I really miss those days." Crow let out a chuckle that made Huai Shi shudder. It grabbed the invitation and flew into its own studio, locking the door so that Huai Shi would not disturb it. "I'm done for. I'm going to die because of her again." Huai Shi's expression twitched. He found that he had gotten used to jumping into traps. After thinking for a long time, he shook his head and sighed. Then he went to take a shower. Hopefully, this witch's night wouldn't be too troublesome. Well, it would be best if they could win the battle peacefully. Please don't let anything bad happen. He prayed with all his heart. When it was close to midnight, Huai Shi lay on his bed, clutching the unrecognizable invitation in his hand. There was an extremely thin layer of circuit attached to the paper, as if it was a memory card that had been pulled out from somewhere. As he held it in his hand, he could feel a faint resonance with his origin substance. It was as if they were one. You didn't mess around, did you? Huaishir was still a little worried. Rest assured, Crow said proudly, if you want to cheat, you can't cheat too much. At least, you can't let others see it. Who doesn't know how to cheat? But if you cheat so skillfully that others can't say anything, that's another matter. What did you do? Huaishir grew more and more uneasy. I open a back door for you. When you enter the witch's dream, your privileges will be increased due to some unexpected reasons. I guarantee that no one will be able to tell. No matter how many times they check, they'll only find that it was a small accident. However, I don't know the exact situation inside the witch's night, so I don't dare to randomly give you unlimited HP, unlimited MP, automatic headlock, and other such functions. I can only guarantee that you have a slight advantage over others. You can just think of it as a few extra stat points. Crow paused for a moment, then smiled happily. While you're at it, you can also call for help when necessary and ask for outside assistance. There won't be a problem? Huaishir was stunned. Of course there will be. Crow glanced at him. But you're about to die. If you have any tricks you can use, you should use them. Otherwise, wouldn't it be stupid to die for nothing if you had to cheat? What you say makes a lot of sense. Huaishir changed to a more comfortable position and lay down. He was still worried. But I always feel like you're trying to trick me. You have to think on the bright side. Crow said, this time you might be able to see the little girl named Lily. Aren't you surprised and surprised? Really? Huaishir was overjoyed. Ahaha, of course it's fake. What do you think? Crow sneered twice and cruelly extinguished Huaishir's little bit of expectation. What the witch's dream of the creator can bring is just a gift of the last inheritance. It's useless for the creator of the same level. Otherwise, it would have been divided up by the Astronomy Association. How could it be your turn? Then why did you mention this? Huaishir glared at her. Isn't this to let you relax a little? Crow raised her wing and pointed to Huaishir's hand. You should be on your way. What? Huaishir looked down at his hand in a panic. He didn't see what was going on. His vision went black, and he fell into a sudden dizziness. It was as if he had suddenly fallen into an abyss. He fell down without any support. After abandoning his body, only his consciousness and soul fell into a slowly rising bubble. He was thrown into that fleeting bubble. The whispers of countless people sounded in his ears and surged into his soul. The vast flow of information that even a sublimator couldn't withstand drowned all his consciousness. He fell into a long sleep. 3 minutes earlier, a drenched girl walked out of the bathroom with a towel in one hand and fumbled around in a flurry. Hairdryer, hairdryer. Where did I put the hairdryer? Although the hotel provided a hairdryer, she felt that the quality wasn't very good. It looked like her hair would fall out. It was better to use her own, but she didn't know where to put it. No matter how she looked, she couldn't find it. In the end, she could only open her luggage and look out one by one. Then he saw an invitation letter that had been casually stuffed into it. What's this? He picked up the invitation blankly and waved it. Are they preparing the wedding invitation now? The phone rang anxiously. She saw that there were several missed calls from her mother, who was now calling the hotel room's landline. Hello, Mom. I'm at the hotel. She tilted her head and held the phone, looking around the room. Do you know where I put the hairdryer? The invitation? Are you talking about the one you stuffed in your bag? Oh, right, I just took it out. Do you want to use it? In that instant, she heard a serious order coming from the phone. That's not yours. Put it down immediately, right now. It was the first time she had heard such a serious, such a panicked tone from her mother. Fu-Yi subconsciously lowered her head and looked at the invitation in her hand. At the last moment, the thought that emerged in her mind was, wow, this thing is actually glowing? So powerful. Huaishir opened his eyes from the nightmare. He suddenly jumped up from the ground and looked around in horror. He had a long dream. In the dream, he trudged through a barren desert, enduring hunger, thirst, pain, and the scorching sun. He struggled to survive, saying goodbye to one oasis after another, just to avoid the death that followed him like a shadow. There was a great fear rising from his heart. It was like escaping from death. But countless companions had died, and only he was lucky enough to escape to this land that had not been invaded by disaster and ushered in a new life. As if he had just recovered from serious illness, he struggled to support his body and looked around. He saw a small cave that could only accommodate him. It was even difficult for him to stretch his limbs. It was better to say that it was a crack in the stone. Wasn't this a bit too miserable? But then he felt something that shocked him. His divine mark seemed to have not been brought in at all. Only a little weak soul power could be retained by relying on the back door opened by Crow. Feeling the weakness in his limbs and the hunger in his stomach, he clearly felt that he was now on the verge of death. If he couldn't find food to replenish his calories, he might die in a few minutes. Hunger, weakness, and fear. All kinds of feelings that remained in his original body constantly emerged in his consciousness, urging him to quickly embark on a new journey to seek a chance of survival in the disaster. Otherwise, there was only death. Huaisha focused on recalling things about the disaster, but he couldn't remember the details of the beginning. He could only recall the sky that was burned by flames, the cracked earth, and the mountains that sank into the deep sea. Birds were crying, beasts were roaring, and in the overwhelming smoke, there was only death, death, and death. He had to escape. He had to go to the place where the disaster had not yet arrived. Only in this way could there be a chance of survival. Only in this way could he continue to survive. The fear and gratitude from the bottom of his heart released the last bit of strength in his weak body. He screamed hoarsely and climbed up from the ground with his hands and feet. He climbed out of the cave. Then he saw a vast expanse of white snow in front of him. The biting cold wind whistled with snowflakes, bringing with it a chill that seeped into his bones. Behind him, there was a towering snow mountain, extending to the end of his sight like a giant wall, surrounding this piece of land. When he looked into the distance, he could see rivers and green mountains. It was like a paradise. He rolled and crawled down. His whole body was soaked in snow, and he shivered. He used the last of his strength to run toward this new home. Between the cracks of the stone, he found a mouse that couldn't escape in time. Huaisha was so hungry that he even forgot about making a fire. He directly pounced on the mouse, opened his mouth, and bit off the mouse's head. He ground his teeth and sucked the blood. He was hungry and thirsty. When the warm blood and flesh filled his empty lungs, he felt that he had finally come back to life. There was a new vitality emerging from the inside of his body, giving him the strength to continue moving forward. So, he continued to trudge toward the foot of the mountain not far away. From stumbling to steadiness, he was running at top speed. In the face of the cold wind, he ran with large strides, as if he had endless strength. Feeling the power passed down by his ancestors boiling in his blood, he roared to the sky. He forgot about the cold and ran wildly. Suddenly, he jumped into a small stream with broken ice and took a refreshing bath. Then, he shook his body and shook off the water droplets on his fur and tail. Wait, fur? Tail? Huaisha finally felt that something was not right. He lowered his head and looked at the gradually calming water surface and his own face in the reflection. Well, this serious frown, this evil and deep ice-blue eyes, the unruly and domineering look, and the classic simple black and white color scheme. Woof! In the reflection on the water surface, a husky that had just been running around froze in place. What should I do if I become a dog? Waiting online urgent. You're tuning in to the Warrior Lore YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.